Revolution, the transformation of Russia economy. Welcome to today's lecture, where we delve into the complexities of the Soviet Union's formative years, exploring the intricate relationship between its revolution, war communism, and the subsequent aftermath. The first decade of the USSR presents a study in contrasts, a time when the state's capitalist development, though seemingly contradictory, was indeed successful. The Bolsheviks, steering the nation, were under the impression they were laying the groundwork for a socialist society, a stepping stone towards communism. However, our analysis suggests a different reality. The Bolsheviks, once they transformed into the Soviet state, positioned a select group of their own as the controllers and distributors of the surplus produced by the industrial workers. This approach was not replicated in agriculture, where a vast number of private, traditional producers continued to thrive, later joined by a small segment of private capitalist farmers. A notable plan of the Bolsheviks was to socialize housework, aiming to eliminate individual household production. This goal, however, remained unrealized, leaving feudal and traditional class structures dominant within households. We'll discuss the limited experiments with communist class structures in households in detail in Chapter 7. Our examination of this era in Soviet history focuses on the different class structures that emerged: state capitalism in industry, a blend of private, traditional, and small capitalist structures in agriculture, and the persistence of feudal and traditional systems within households. We'll explore the internal contradictions of these structures, understanding how they supported yet also undermined each other, contributing to the complex fabric of Soviet society. This period was marked by a rapidly developing state capitalism, fraught with class tensions and conflicts. These dynamics, intertwined with various non-class processes, led to a social crisis and rupture as the 1920s drew to a close. Interestingly, the surplus in Soviet industry was appropriated not by the workers, but by state officials right from the onset. This surplus, generated across numerous industrial enterprises, was centrally controlled by a few top state officials. Initially named Vysenka and later known as the Council of Ministers, these officials distributed the industrial surplus to maintain the state capitalist class structure, shaping the politics, economy, and culture of the time. However, this process was far from smooth, with continual challenges and crises. The evolving relationship between state capitalist industry and the various class structures in agriculture is particularly telling. The fluctuating terms of trade between industry and agriculture reflected and contributed to the uneven development of different class structures, ultimately accelerating the expansion of state capitalism. Despite the dominance and impressive economic development of state capitalism, significant social discontent and turmoil emerged. Across the USSR's history, worker exploitation remained a constant theme, with one form of exploitative class structure often replacing another. Post-1917, private capitalism in industry was supplanted by enduring state capitalism. In agriculture, the revolution virtually eliminated private capitalism, giving rise to numerous small traditional farmers, soon joined by capitalist farms re-established under the NEP reforms. Despite limited attempts at communist structures in the 1920s, exploitation was a significant reality in Soviet agriculture as well. Even Soviet households, primarily feudal but also significantly traditional in their class structures, saw little change. From 1917 to 1940, the Soviet state and party firmly established and expanded state capitalism as the dominant class structure in industrial enterprises. Industrial growth became the top economic priority, with the understanding that funding for this growth couldn't solely rely on surpluses from state capitalist industries. Instead, it required additional value inflows from the traditional and capitalist structures in agriculture. This chapter begins our journey through this rich history, examining the interaction between industrial expansion, the multiple class structures in both industry and agriculture, and the transfers of value from agriculture to support industrial growth, changing the state and class structures. In this lecture, we'll focus on the changing state and class structures in the USSR after 1917, with an emphasis on the production functions and their implications. Our analysis begins with the Soviet state, but we swiftly pivot to a deeper exploration of class dynamics, recognizing that the state is just one element in a complex web of factors influencing Soviet history. The state, rather than being a mere tool of a specific class or group, was a nexus of contradictions, influenced by a myriad of class and non-class factors. One key aspect to understand is the value flows between the Soviet state and other societal elements. We examine the budget equation of the Tsarist state in class terms, categorizing value flows as either appropriations or distributions of surplus or as non-class flows. This equation reveals the intricate interplay between state revenues and expenditures, shaped by the class structures of the time. Before 1917, the Tsarist state was an active participant in capitalist class structures, appropriating surplus value from laborers in state-run enterprises. The state made various subsumed class payments to support this form of state capitalism, including salaries for state bureaucrats managing these enterprises and contributions to the church, among others. These expenditures were crucial for maintaining the state's capitalist revenue streams. The state also engaged with other class structures, receiving income from private capitalist, ancient and feudal enterprises, and in return, provided conditions for surplus production. These interactions required state expenditures, which in turn enabled the collection of revenues. For example, the Tsarist state supported private capitalists with military protection, market regulations, and ideological support, while also extending credits and receiving interest payments. Post-1917, the Bolsheviks' attempt to abolish private capitalism meant a significant shift in these state functions. The state's expenditures to support private capitalists decreased, as did the revenues from them. The new Soviet state equation reflects these changes, with the Bolshevik policies leading to the disappearance of certain capitalist revenue and expenditure categories, and the potential introduction of communist class structures both within and outside the state. However, our analysis found little evidence of communist class structures within state enterprises. The state's appropriation and distribution of surplus labor continued in a manner similar to the Tsarist era, despite the change in personnel. This indicates that the fundamental exploitative relationship between producers and appropriators of surplus labor remained largely unaltered. Private communism did emerge in certain forms, particularly in some household and collective farm structures. These developments are critical in understanding the state's relationship with different class structures post-revolution. Interestingly, the Soviet state continued to operate within state capitalist, private ancient, and private feudal class structures, even after the 1917 revolution. The Council of Ministers, replacing the Tsar, appropriated and distributed surpluses produced in state enterprises, maintaining a capitalist mode of production, appropriation, and distribution. In conclusion, the post-1917 Soviet state and its interaction with various class structures present a complex picture of continuity and change. The state, intertwined with these class structures, faced new contradictions and challenges, significantly influencing Soviet policies and the overall trajectory of Soviet history. Organizing the new class structures, the term war communism is commonly used to describe the early phase of the Soviet economy. This period was marked by the Soviet state's significant steps to overcome foreign military invasion and internal civil strife following the 1917 revolution. The state's initiatives included nationalizing industrial production, curtailing private markets and the use of money, and directly controlling labor and resource allocation. Centralizing industrial production and fostering agricultural surplus for rapid industrial development were key goals, managed by a burgeoning state bureaucracy. This analysis seeks to explore the class dimensions of this tumultuous period, particularly focusing on how war communism functioned more as a variant of capitalism, rather than a realization of communist class structure. Despite the absence of private property, free markets, and money, the essential capitalist class structure persisted, where surpluses produced by workers were appropriated and distributed by state officials. War communism thus represented a unique form of state capitalism, where the focus on markets, ownership, and monetary aspects overshadowed the prevailing capitalist class structures. In contrast, the regime's experiments with communist class structures were limited and mostly confined to household work. Despite bold steps towards socializing productive wealth and reorienting state policy towards workers' and peasants' interests, these efforts fell short of establishing genuine communist fundamental class processes. The focus remained on property distribution and state control rather than on the organization of surplus labor. As we proceed, we'll examine how the Soviet state organized the production, appropriation, and distribution of surpluses in its industrial enterprises. The key players were state officials, particularly those in the Supreme Council of National Economy, or Vysenka, who function like a centralized board of a capitalist enterprise. These officials, despite operating under a socialist state with collective ownership, essentially appropriated and distributed surplus labor in a manner akin to private capitalist entities. This analysis also delves into the mutual dependence of class and non-class processes in the Soviet context. The state apparatus's distribution of surpluses to various sectors and institutions, including the Communist Party, played a crucial role in sustaining the state capitalist class structure. These distributions supported political, cultural, and economic processes necessary for the continued appropriation of industrial surpluses by the state. Furthermore, we'll explore how the Soviet industrial economy, particularly under Stalin, expanded to encompass agricultural production, solidifying its state capitalist nature. Despite changes in organizational structure and policy, the Soviet state remained fundamentally rooted in a capitalist class structure throughout its history. In summary, this exploration aims to provide a nuanced understanding of the Soviet economic system, particularly during war communism and its aftermath. It highlights the complexities and contradictions inherent in the Soviet experiment with socialism, showing how the reality of state capitalism prevailed over the envisioned communist ideals. A class and value analysis of war communism, data analysis to consolidate power during the Civil War and repel external aggression. The Soviet government rapidly altered or abolished various class structures deemed detrimental to production and, consequently, to the war effort in socialism. Carr 1985, 73-100. Siriani 1982. These class structures encompassed 1. Certain Soviets from before and after the revolution, likely ephemeral communist classes formed by workers' committees in privately owned industrial firms seized early in the revolution. 2. Industries returned to private ownership post-revolution. 3. Sectors managed by trade unions. And 4. Diverse regional and central governmental committees running industrial operations. The Soviet regime ultimately replaced these with a homogenized, centralized state-controlled industrial capitalism, with Vysenka as the primary collector of surplus. However, this transformation spawned new paradoxes, including class contradictions largely unrecognized by Soviet leaders and cadres due to their theoretical models, which overlooked these contradictions' existence and impacts. A crucial non-class contradiction emerged between the state and industrial sector versus the peasantry, becoming a pivotal element in Soviet debates, policies, and subsequent crises. The Soviet leadership's reliance on a nascent industrial state capitalism, and vice versa, was interdependent with non-capitalist class structures external to industry and the state, primarily the vast number of individual peasant producers. These peasants, in their traditional class structure, privately produced, appropriated, and distributed their surplus labor. Their numbers surged due to Bolshevik land allocations to returning soldiers, ex-feudal tenants, and former agricultural wage laborers, thus replacing private capitalist and feudal remnants with privately managed ancient class-structured farms. For the development of state industrial capitalism, it was essential to increasingly extract food and raw materials from these private ancient farmers. However, if these farmers sold their produce to the state industry, reinforcing their non-capitalist class structures, this could potentially challenge or undermine state capitalism and Soviet political dominance. This potential for conflict between state capitalist enterprises and private ancient farmers over aspects like state-determined prices, subsidies, policies, and new legislations was foreseeable. The Bolsheviks partially acknowledged and increasingly stressed over these class structure contradictions, although not conceptualizing them as such. Their concerns centered on a politically and economically fortified non-socialist peasant sector and the emergence of small capitalist classes within it during the 1920s, potentially hampering or even threatening socialism or industrial state capitalism and the Soviet state. The Bolsheviks' focus during and after war communism was on balancing support for private ancient and small capitalist farmers while limiting the adverse effects of their productivity. Debates and struggles, such as the choice between market mechanisms or state allocation for securing rural products, were significant topics among historians. Carr 1954, 89-92. Yet their analyses lacked the class perspective outlined here. State industrial capitalists under the Vysenka umbrella needed to acquire labor power, which, as Marx described, involved paying wages to laborers. These wages reflected the values assigned to labor power by a state planning body using a Marxian system. This entailed calculating the types and amounts of commodities workers needed to sustain their labor power at a socialist acceptable level. then determining the socially necessary abstract labor hours needed for producing these commodities, thus establishing their values. The value of workers' wages was set to approximately match the value of this commodity bundle. The surplus value in Soviet industry was the difference between the state-set values of labor power and production inputs on one side and the state-set values of industrial outputs on the other, produced by laborers in state capitalist industries and appropriated and distributed by Vasenka. The Marxian capitalist production formula, C plus V plus S equals W, where C represents input commodity values, V labor power value, W output value, and S the residual surplus value, was aptly applicable. The Soviets employed a similar value system to navigate their state-industrial capitalism's internal class contradictions and manage relations, including market interactions, between state capitalist and private non-capitalist class structures in Soviet society. This management included setting state market prices diverging from the state's value calculations, a crucial element in the class contradictions and history of the post-war communism decade. The fundamental state equation in this context, SVC plus SSCR C plus A plus F plus NCR equals SSCP plus X C plus A plus F plus Y, reflects Vasenka's appropriation of state industrial surplus value, SVC, as state revenue and its distribution as subsumed class payments, SSCPC, to support necessary non-class processes for sustaining state capitalism. The extensive Soviet bureaucracies, including the Communist Party, local enterprise managers, the Red Army, etc., relied on this surplus appropriation and distribution for their functionality, just as state capitalism depended on their performance of these non-class processes. During war communism, a significant portion of SSCPC funded essential military expenses for the Civil War. Maximizing SVC was crucial to enhance SSCPC for the war effort, leading to intensified exploitation of industrial workers. This exploitation hinged on acquiring food and raw materials from private ancient farmers, whose quality, quantity, and values influenced the surplus value generated by state enterprises for the war effort. Ironically, the Soviet state defended its revolution against private capitalist exploitation by intensifying its state capitalist exploitation. A Marxian value analysis of war communism elucidates the new Soviet state's challenges in both industrial and agricultural production. Starting with basic definitions, let VC represent the state-administered value, average money wages, of labor power purchased from industrial laborers and utilized in state capitalist enterprises. CC denotes the state-administered value of all produced tools, equipment, and raw materials consumed in industrial production. UV symbolizes the various physical commodities, use values, produced by state capitalist industries, with EVs representing the values assigned to each UV by state bureaucrats. These bureaucrats determined VC by equating it to the product of the bundle of produced goods, UVs, consumed by laborers as real wages multiplied by the values, EVs, assigned to each UV in that bundle. To simplify, assuming laborers consumed only food grown by ancient farmers, UVF, the value of productive labor power, VC, equals the quantity of items in the workers' food bundle, UVF, multiplied by the value per unit of those items, EV-UVF. Thus, VC equals EV-UVF x UVF. The value of tools, buildings, and other commodity inputs, CC, used in production is similarly calculated as EV-UVC multiplied by UVC. CC equals EV-UVC x UVC. For raw materials provided by private ancient farmers to state capitalist industry, we divide CC into two components. CRM-C, for the value of agricultural raw materials like cotton, sugar beets, tobacco, etc., used in producing industrial commodities, and CINN-C, for the value of non-agricultural industrial input commodities. Thus, CRM-C equals EV-CRM x UVRM represents the value of agricultural inputs as the product of state-set values of raw material inputs multiplied by the physical quantity of such materials used in producing industrial commodities. Continuing our class analysis of the food and raw material challenges faced by Soviet state capitalism during war communism and the NEP period, we note the absence of private markets legally under war communism, while private markets and prices coexisted with state markets and prices under the NEP. Given the low productivity of ancient farmers, the state capitalist industry's urgent need for food and raw materials during the war, surpassed what the farmers could supply. The Soviet state had options in terms of pricing strategies. One option was to set prices for raw materials and food higher than their production costs, determined by state officials based on average labor hours required for production. This approach could have encouraged greater agricultural supplies by offering ancient farmers a profit margin above costs. However, this would have constrained the state's purchases due to budgetary limits, negatively impacting prioritized industrial growth. Initially rejecting this strategy due to its detrimental effect on industrial growth and the war effort, the state adopted a drastic approach of significantly lowering the state-administered prices for essential food and raw materials, effectively compelling ancient farmers to supply them at minimal or no value. War communism essentially became a state-enforced requisition of these resources rather than a trade. Over time, Soviet officials fluctuated between these pricing strategies due to the various contradictions each strategy provoked. Considering what might have occurred had the Soviet state chosen to implement the first pricing strategy, raising state-set prices of food and raw materials above their unit values helps understand why this policy was not adopted during war communism, but partially during the NEP. If state officials had increased food prices, the impact on industrial workers would have depended on other state actions. For instance, if the state had also raised wages proportionally, industrial workers could have maintained their consumption levels. This wage policy, likely due to the ideological and political significance of industrial workers in Bolshevik socialism, would have meant raising the price of labor power above its value, PLPC, greater than VC, aligning with the increase in food prices. However, allocating higher wages from the surpluses of state capitalist enterprises would have positioned these workers in a subsumed class relation to state industrial capitalists, necessitating a new subsumed class payment, SSCPC workers equals PLPC, VC. While this might have preserved labor peace by maintaining real wages, it would have equivalently reduced the surplus value available for other essential distributions for state capitalist industry. In the early USSR years, this would have meant compromising surplus allocations for the war effort, post-war reconstruction and industrial development, threatening the new society's survival. Resolving one problem set would have thus triggered another. Class contradictions after war communism demonstrated a strategy for state management of class contradictions within industrial state capitalism and those between it and the class structures of post-revolutionary agriculture. By requisitioning food and raw materials and effectively setting their prices below market value, it circumvented many contradictions while creating new ones. These class contradictions and policy issues remain central for the USSR even after war communism ended, and as Soviet social conditions evolved. Throughout the 1920s and beyond, the class contradictions and policy options associated with war communism resurfaced under the scissors crisis. When prices for agricultural products rose relative to industrial goods, state capitalist enterprises faced reduced funds for industrial expansion. This situation, described as a price scissors, undermined the state and party's top priority. Soviet leaders, adhering to their vision of successful socialist development, responded by adjusting prices to narrow this gap, repeatedly emphasizing the goal of maximizing the flow of food, raw materials, and workers into industry while minimizing the reverse. The Soviet policy could either gently persuade or minimally coerce private farmers to provide increasing quantities of food and raw materials at stable prices. In this scenario, Vysenka could plan for a proportional expansion of the industrial labor force and its equipment, in line with the increase in agricultural deliveries. In a more aggressive form, reminiscent of war communism's requisitioning, the state could alter trade terms unfavorably for farmers, reducing the prices of food and raw materials and consequently the wages of industrial workers, thus benefiting state capitalist industry through increased surplus value and enabling further accumulation of industrial means. This policy, however, posed risks to the survival of private farmers in the 1920s, potentially pushing them out of agriculture and into urban industry. The Soviet industrialization policy faced the danger of farmers responding in ways other than migrating to industrial jobs, possibly challenging the Soviet development strategy and system. Lenin, recognizing these risks during war communism, introduced the new economic policy, NEP, in 1921. However, the fundamental challenges and strategic options persisted post-requisitioning. The state had to replace requisitioning with manipulations of trade terms between state capitalist industry and private agriculture. This led to a class shift in agriculture, with some farmers selling their land and labor to more successful peers, creating a small-scale private capitalist class. The state's NEP pricing policies soon faced backlash from both private farmers and the growing number of small capitalist farmers. This necessitated yet another adjustment to the state's strategy, leading to the collectivization of agriculture. This policy sought to manage the inherent contradictions within state capitalist industry and the more complex class structures in agriculture, aiming to maximize industrial capacity and output. Soviet debates over economic strategy often overlooked the class structures involved, focusing instead on non-class-related causes for the crises. The consensus blamed rural capitalists and richer farmers for economic issues, leading to a strategic shift by the end of the 1920s towards finishing the anti-capitalist revolution, transforming agriculture's class structures. Collectivization replaced both ancient and small capitalist class structures in rural areas, but did not establish state communism. Instead, it led to the creation of private collective farms and state farm enterprises, marking the only large-scale establishment of communism in Soviet history. This, however, did not resolve the tensions and conflicts within and between different class structures in Soviet society, which contributed to the ongoing challenges and crises of the era. Revolution, class, and the Soviet household today, we delve into a topic often overlooked in social history analyses: the role of households, particularly in the context of the Soviet Union. Our journey through this chapter will lay the groundwork for understanding the intricate class dynamics within Soviet households, a theme we will revisit and expand upon in our final discussions on the broader class structure of Soviet society. The significance of examining household class structures lies in three pivotal considerations. Firstly, the majority of individuals spend a considerable portion of their lives within households, where the production of goods and services frequently involves a surplus, indicative of an underlying class structure. In the USSR, we observe distinct class structures within households. Secondly, these household class structures likely had significant interactions with external class structures, influencing all facets of social life. Thirdly, the experiences within these household class structures during one's formative years could predispose Soviet adults towards certain class structures, both inside and outside the home. The class structures within Soviet households, inherited from pre-revolutionary Russia, evolved in some aspects while remaining constant in others. We'll explore how these changes and consistencies contributed to sustaining state capitalism in Soviet industry, but also how they presented certain challenges. Crucially, the feasibility of introducing and sustaining communist class structures in Soviet industrial and agricultural enterprises was partly contingent on how Soviet society managed these household class structures. Interestingly, Soviet policies only inadvertently influenced these internal class structures, reflecting a blind spot in Marxian theories of the time, which lacked a concept of class within households and thus had no strategy for their transformation. The Bolsheviks' policies towards households mirrored this oversight, failing to address class in its surplus sense, much like their approach to communism and state capitalism. The departure of 14 million Russian men for World War I radically altered many rural household class structures. With husbands gone, women had to navigate a new reality. They were no longer merely performing household surplus labor for their husbands within the typical feudal class structure of Russian households. Instead, they faced a choice: either step into the role of heads of feudal households themselves, or perform and appropriate their own household surplus labor, marking a shift from feudal to ancient class structures. This situation was aptly summarized at a women's congress in 1916. Once the men are gone, peasant women have no other recourse except to do the men's work. The class transformations within households due to the 1917 revolution were already underway for many Russian housewives, albeit not entirely new, as they echoed the experiences of Russian widows from previous centuries. The war brought about a form of mass widowhood, propelling millions of wives of deceased or incapacitated soldiers into new roles either as feudal lords of their households or as heads of ancient class households. Post-war Russia saw a mix of male-headed and female-headed feudal and ancient class-structured households. This shift led to new societal tensions, with women surplus appropriators often becoming less willing to accept the political and cultural subordination typical of pre-revolutionary Russia. The class transformations experienced by women had ripple effects throughout society, altering the traditional image of the male as the dominant figure in households. These tensions between men and women, rooted in the class history of Russian households, persisted as enduring features of Soviet society. The cultural narrative of husbands as burdens on women within feudal and ancient households became entrenched in Soviet culture. The complexity of these dynamics underscores the profound impact of household class structures on Soviet society. As we continue, we'll delve deeper into how these structures influence the broader societal landscape, shaping the USSR's unique historical trajectory. Bolshevik class blindness. Feudal and ancient class structures prevailed as household class structures after 1917, but they were not the only ones. Communist class structures, where residents collectively produced and appropriated their household surplus, also emerged as part of the revolutionary experiments in household reorganization after 1917, Stites 1989, 205-222. Among movements advocating for communes, a few established actual communist class structures for household production. Revolutionary militants in both rural and urban areas primarily established these household communes. Drawing inspiration from the history of socialism and Marxism, they also revived old Russian traditions, both religious and secular, favoring collective living arrangements. These efforts attracted a diverse group, including widows, orphans, vagabonds, returned soldiers without families, and rural emigrants arriving in cities. The extreme post-war shortages of housing, jobs, and food also drove many to find communes an affordable household option. The immediate post-1917 years, filled with euphoria and danger, saw the establishment of various communes across the USSR. Many included households within the realm of what was to be communized. However, the term commune was interpreted differently in different contexts. Sometimes it meant shared housing, dining, or childcare, with families collectively owning the household's productive assets or pooling resources to hire external help for tasks like cleaning and cooking. Other times, it primarily referred to collective decision-making regarding the political or ideological activities of the group, or even focused on interpersonal relations, especially policies and behaviors related to sexuality and parenting. Not all household communes entailed a communist class structure of household production. While most did not, those that did had all adult members collectively producing, appropriating, and distributing their household surpluses to sustain its communist class structure. However, they did not frame their households in such class terms, as these terms were not part of acceptable public discourse. They believed that the collectivized property and power of the militants' household communes justified the label communist. For most, the organization of household surplus labor was irrelevant to communism. Even those that established household communist class structures did so as extensions of their collectivization of property and power, rather than as a central political objective. Since communist class structures were not characteristic of Soviet industry, their only urban manifestations were a small subset of these household communes. From 1918 to 1931-32, the Soviet Union officially supported and even subsidized many household communes and their experiments in communist class structures. Lenin, 1959, 335, 388, Stites 1989, 222. The transition to a communism defined by social justice, equality, democracy, and solidarity seemed to justify such households too. Vladimir Mayakovsky encapsulated this sentiment in his poetry, Stites 1989, 205, suggesting that communism extended beyond work to every aspect of daily life. Thus, the years of war, revolution, and war communism transformed the Soviet household. Feudal households underwent major changes, and millions faced abrupt transitions to ancient household structures. Meanwhile, radically different communist class structures and household communes emerged, garnering praise and support from the state and party. This period presented a unique class conjuncture of transitional possibilities that was disorienting, troubling, yet full of promise. However, the class dimensions often went unrecognized. The Soviet state could have acted to weaken the conditions for feudal and ancient household class structures while bolstering those for communist households. Policies might have included higher taxes for non-communist households, greater subsidies and services for communist ones, and educational campaigns to encourage the adoption of internal communist class structures in line with revolutionary goals. However, none of these policies fostering communist class structures within households were debated, adopted, or even unofficially pursued by the Soviet state. Early Soviet discussions did address the need to eliminate purely feudal marriage law, Goldman, 1993, 192, but this did not extend to conceptualizing a feudal household class structure shaped by such laws. A 1922 Soviet Supreme Court decision labeled women's household work as productive labor, Goldman, 1993, 194-196, a significant point given the Marxist distinction between productive and unproductive labor. However, this was not further explored to identify the specific mode of producing and distributing surplus within these households. The Communist Party might have campaigned for or against certain household class structures, arguing that the revolution's success depended on establishing communist class-structured households. Leaders like Lenin, Bukharin, and Trotsky might have become renowned for their stances on household class structures. Yet neither the party nor the state prioritized class transitions within Soviet households as a subject for debate or policy decision, both during the revolution and later in the USSR's history. Here's an improved version of the text with enhanced grammar and clarity. Blank underscore blank, the lack of a class theory of households and the disinterest among state and party leaders contributed to the predominance of feudal and ancient structures in Soviet households. Household communes and communist class structures within some of these households remain very limited movements, marginal to the mainstream Soviet society. By the early 1930s, even their marginal status had disappeared, leaving the household realm of Soviet life to the contradictions and tensions of feudal and ancient class structures. Thus, class exploitation continued throughout Soviet society, not only in state enterprises but also in most households. After the early 1930s, feudal and ancient structures were the only household class structures into which Soviet citizens were born, matured, and formed their initial class understandings and loyalties, both unconscious and conscious. Previously, Soviet citizens might have occasionally heard about, conceived of, or encountered household class structures other than the feudal and ancient ones that had prevailed throughout centuries of Tsarist society. The communes that arose after 1917 likely appeared more compatible with the revolutionary new regime to many. As Mayakovsky's poetry suggests, there were places where Soviet citizens could at least imagine communism at home. The ironies, tragedies, and social consequences of this class history of Soviet households warrant attention to its diverse causes. Early Soviet society exhibited widespread pockets of social conservatism. Massel, 1974. Successive Soviet regimes feared alienating their peasant supporters with excessive changes, especially those close to home. A prevalent productivist bias in Soviet thought downplayed the importance of developments within households, considering them less important or dependent on conditions in factories and farms. Goldman, 1993, 132-133. Another factor contributing to the class history of Soviet households was how leading state and party figures theorized household production and its management by the new Soviet regime. They occasionally recognized and criticized general household production relations. However, their response was typically to propose the elimination of all production, and hence class, from the household. They did not explore the potential for alternative class structures within households, preventing the formation of explicit policies on such structures. Feminist critics have condemned the successive Soviet leaderships for their single-minded focus on production and their failure to fulfill promises of socializing household labor and fostering more equal relations between men and women. Goldman, 1993, 343. Much feminist literature views the Soviet experience as part of a broader Marxian theory and practice that marginalizes gender relations in favor of positioning production relations as the primary determinants of all social structures and histories, including those of men and women in families and households. Barrett, 1980. 24. While these feminist perspectives capture some of the overdeterminants of the Soviet experience, they also overlook other aspects that merit emphasis. The issue and irony lie in the fact that Marxian class analysis of production was not applied to the Soviet household. Soviet policy proceeded without addressing the direct and often antagonistic class relations between men and women in relation to household production. Consequently, while the USSR achieved improvements in several aspects of women's lives, education, medical care, formal equality, etc., it did not fundamentally alter their household class positions and the resulting consequences. Some types of Marxism used by Soviet leaders blinded them to the class relations within households. However, other Marxist theories of household class structures, if utilized by Soviet leaders, might have fundamentally altered Soviet history. It was not Marxism in general, but specific Marxian tendencies that dominated Soviet leadership thinking, obscuring the capitalist class structures of state-industrial enterprises, the feudal and ancient class structures of Soviet households, and even the communist class structure of household communes. This conceptual blindness also contributed to the eventual collapse of the Soviet Union's original revolutionary goals and the USSR itself. The initial Soviet goal was to eliminate the individual household as a social site. This was based on the belief that women's oppressed status within households, overwork, lack of education, sexual servitude, etc., necessitated its elimination as a central socialist policy goal. Additionally, since building the socialist economic base required the labor of both women and men outside the household, women had to be freed from housework. Bolsheviks drew on principles from respected authorities like Engels's Origin of the Family, Private Property, and the State, 1969b, to articulate these ideas. Engels described the modern family as based on the domestic slavery of the wife and compared the household dynamics to class exploitation. However, he did not systematically explore class structures within households. Lenin and Trotsky also alluded to the class dimensions of households, but their insights remained undeveloped, lacking imagination for alternative household class structures. The Bolsheviks sought to eradicate the individual household as a site of production, echoing Engels's call for the abolition of the monogamous family as the economic unit of society. The Woman Question, 1951-40. Lenin viewed the emancipation of women and the advent of real communism as beginning with a mass struggle against the petty domestic economy. The Woman Question, 1951-56. Influential theorists like Clara Zetkin and Alexandra Kollontai contributed to this Bolshevik perspective. Zetkin historically argued that machine production rendered women's economic activities within families obsolete, turning domestic activity into economic nonsense. Kollontai further concluded that families no longer produced but only consumed. 1977, 117, 254. Arguments that production conditions within households were intolerable clashed with assertions that production had ceased there, leaving only consumption. Partly to resolve this inconsistency, the Bolsheviks believed capitalism had partially dismantled the family and individual household as sites of production. This left women and children engaged in marginal household work under poor conditions, while men worked in the socialized and modernized sectors outside the household. The Bolsheviks aimed to complete what capitalism had started, liberating women and children from household drudgery and slavery. The individual household was to be dismantled. Neither production nor consumption should occur there. The goals of women's equality and expanding industrial production would thus be achieved simultaneously. The state planned to socialize housework by transferring it from individual households to state-run enterprises, which would produce meals, clean clothes, and living spaces, care for children, etc. All consumption of these products would occur collectively, not in individual households. Kollontai, 1977, 255 ff. In Bolshevik thought, the socialization of housework would eradicate the domestic slavery of women, leading to genuine equality of the sexes and similar work lives for both men and women in socialist enterprises. Traditional families and households would be replaced by free unions of equally productive and free adults. Children would receive loving care from state-run enterprises prioritized for support, with parent-child interactions based on free desire. From 1917 through the early 1920s, most Bolshevik commentators argued that socialism and the transition to communism necessitated the total disappearance of individual households. However, the exigencies of war, revolution, foreign invasion, and civil war presented the Soviet state with emergency conditions, leading to the mass provision of collectively consumed meals and housing. Chase, 1990, 173-213. Kollontai's concept of the withering away of the household seemed to be practically underway, aligning Bolshevik theories with the realities and policies of the time. Serious attention was not given to the possibility that individual household units similar to those before 1917 might survive or redevelop during the 1920s. Initially, there was little concern that Soviet state resources might not sustain mass collective dining, housing, and childcare services beyond emergency circumstances. No fallback Bolshevik policy on individual households was planned or debated if state-socialized housework could not be maintained. No discussions on alternative class structures within households occurred before or after 1917. Bolshevik analysts and policymakers, having developed no theory or policy to distinguish or favor communist over other household class structures, lacked a strategy, revolutionary or otherwise, when individual households demonstrated their mass durability throughout the 1920s. Trotsky, in 1924, lamented that the USSR had achieved economic transformations without touching on the forms of domestic traditions inherited from the past. However, he merely reiterated a vague proposal that individual families group themselves into collective housekeeping units. Trotsky, 1924, 47, 59. No Bolshevik offered proposals on the internal class organization of work, either within the individual households that remained the Soviet norm or within any collective housekeeping units that the state might support or establish. Theoretical blindness to the possibilities, conditions, and social effects of alternative class structures within households significantly impacted Soviet history. This oversight precluded a systematic state policy of favoring certain types of household class structures over others, in contrast, for example, to the explicit Soviet policies regarding class structures in industrial and agricultural enterprises. Lenin, 1959. This class blindness also diminished any chance that the emerging communist class structures in militants' household communes could become models for the USSR at large. The Bolshevik silence on alternative class structures within households had other lasting social effects. As we will see, it influenced policy reactions to the social consequences of the new economic policy after 1921, including the collapse of the war communism's emergency programs for mass state feeding, housing, and childcare, and the subsequent costs of such programs. The eventual policy decision was to revert to the family. The family was expected to produce within the household what the Soviet state could not, or not yet, socialize in state enterprises. In effect, Soviet policy thus endorsed and reinforced the traditional household structures inherited from pre-revolutionary Russia. Farnsworth, 1977. Without a class analysis of households, Soviet leaders and thinkers could not consider, let alone answer, a crucial question. Might their efforts to build what they called socialism fail because they were reinforcing feudal and ancient class structures within households? Yet Lenin had recognized the significant costs of maintaining women in traditional households. In a 1920 conversation with Clara Zetkin, he noted, "So few men, even among the proletariat, realize how much effort and trouble they could save women, even eliminate entirely, if they were to assist in woman's work. But no, that is contrary to the right and dignity of a man. They seek their peace and comfort. The home life of the woman is a daily sacrifice to 1,000 insignificant trivialities. The old master right of the man still survives covertly. His slave seeks her revenge, also in secret. The backwardness of women, their lack of understanding for the revolutionary ideals of the man, diminishes his joy and determination in fighting." The Woman Question, 1951-93. Such acknowledgments of the costs of traditional feudal households became less frequent throughout the 1920s. The reaccommodation to traditional households and families rendered such sentiments from Lenin and others increasingly irrelevant to actual policy and troubling in their critical implications. New economic policy, old household policy. Our Soviet woman has a very hard life. She has to earn a wage and then run around to the shops to find something to feed her family. All her free time and days off are lost in that way. I have to stand in a different line for each product. I have to get to the store before it opens to buy milk. I have to go to another store for cereal. I have to go to Moscow for meat. Mandel, 1994. The new economic policy, NEP, marked a significant retreat in the economic aspirations, resources, and activities of the Soviet state. Concurrently, the USSR's international isolation and the need to recover from the catastrophes of 1914 to 1920 placed enormous demands on the state. Not surprisingly, the de facto state policy toward households shifted away from the envisioned collectivization of the revolution and war communism periods. Politically and economically, the costs of household collectivization were considered too high. One social issue, particularly linked to household and family, became a focal point for crystallized debates, hardened positions, and strategic shifts. The new USSR faced a crisis of 7 million waifs by 1922, as reported by a recent study, Ball, 1996-1. These children, parentless and homeless, roamed urban and rural areas, often resorting to crime for survival, posing a threat to others. Visiting Moscow in 1926, Walter Benjamin described them as derelict, unspeakably melancholy, savage, mistrustful, embittered people, 1986-103. Debates about these children underscored the enormous costs to state institutions of providing for them versus reintegrating them into existing family household structures at a lower state expense. This debate was part of the national discourse on how best to rebuild the nation's infrastructure, invest in industrial growth, and trade consumer goods for agricultural products no longer requisitioned as in war communism. Simultaneously, millions of women without husbands or secure land tenures and demobilized men lacking sufficient income or work pressured the state for public services and support. Partly overwhelmed by these demands after 1917, especially during foreign invasions and civil war, the state had turned to war communism. However, when undermined by resistance from traditionalists, insufficient state resources, and other factors, the state retreated to the NEP. The hope was to better manage its resources. Some demands lessened as the Civil War subsided and opposition decreased, but resources might dwindle if small capitalists and merchants, the netmen, withheld or diverted resources from the state. Bukharin's argument that all classes and strata in Soviet society could contribute to the building of socialism reflected a consensus that the state must cultivate support among those granted relative independence by the NEP, necessitating opposition to Bolsheviks whose programs might incite new discord. Cohen 1980 120. Advocates of communal households increasingly were seen as such disruptive Bolsheviks, potentially undermining crucial public support for the NEP. Soviet leaders abandoned ambitious plans for collective institutions, e.g., dining halls, creches, laundries, to replace individual households. The prohibitive costs of establishing and maintaining these institutions, alongside other priorities in heavy industry and infrastructure, and the weight of conservative traditions, led to a retreat from plans to eliminate individual households. The return to reliance on individual households, however, was not complete. A complete return to pre-revolutionary households would have betrayed the revolution's commitments to women. The 1920s saw significant changes in Soviet laws and social arrangements that greatly improved women's social positions. Laws enabled women to own property, access abortion, divorce, and alimony, and participate politically on equal terms with men. The 1918 Family Code, the 1922 Land Code, and interpretations of these codes progressively enhanced women's roles as heads of households. While enforcement varied regionally, these changes were significant. Despite abandoning household collectivization, the dramatic changes in women's powers and rights within Soviet households did little to alter their basic class positions. The equality advanced by Soviet policies within the old class structures created new challenges, as evidenced by the 1926 Family Code. Households in the 1920s, often strained by simplified divorce and a culture of gender equality, struggled with viability. Men frequently evaded alimony payments, and women, often in smaller households, faced increasing difficulties. Double shifts burdened women who worked for wages outside the home and were still expected to fulfill domestic obligations. The retreat from state-supported collectivization left Soviet citizens with only the pre-revolutionary household class structures, which became increasingly challenging to maintain. The burdens of maintaining these households led to a proliferation of homeless children and women, exacerbating social issues. By the end of the decade, the state not only abandoned its original plans, but also actively promoted traditional feudal household structures. Official doctrine idealized families with men as heads of households, and policies were implemented to enforce alimony payments and discourage divorce. The state, as argued by leading theorist S. Wolfson, had to use these social cells as auxiliary formations in managing the transition through socialism to communism. Goldman, 1993, 310. This reversion to traditional household class structures, while solving some immediate issues, created others. To sustain themselves, feudal and ancient households needed to generate sufficient surplus. Women in these households faced increasing burdens as they undertook paid work outside and managed reduced internal household support. The strains reached critical levels, leading to heightened conflicts, rising rates of alcoholism, divorce, and social tensions. The issues within Soviet households impacted various societal aspects, including workers' productivity, civic participation, children's education, and mental health. Many social problems were partially caused by the class structures of households, yet Soviet thought, both official and popular, largely ignored these class problems, perpetuating the illusion that a pro-family orientation would resolve them. The role of women in Soviet technical education exemplified the impact of unviable household class structures on broader development goals. Women's responsibilities within households interfered with their abilities to undertake necessary training for rapid Soviet development. Official responses inadequately addressed the root causes, focusing instead on promoting more childcare facilities. In 1928, a newspaper report highlighted the impact of traditional household class structures on Soviet society, citing the preference of Kiev's women for private over state or cooperative shops. This preference was driven by the time cost of shopping in different lines for various products, illustrating the additional burden on women managing households. As one woman worker expressed in a 1990 interview, the Soviet woman's life involved not only earning a wage, but also navigating the challenges of shopping and fulfilling household responsibilities. Mandel, 1994-83. In the 1920s, Soviet women, burdened with the sole responsibility for household labor, often shopped at netmen's private stores due to shorter lines, unlike the state and cooperative stores which had longer lines. This preference significantly boosted private profits while reducing state revenues. In essence, the specific class roles of women within their households inadvertently impacted the Soviet state's financial resources for development. As documented by Goldman, 1993, many Soviet women leaders highlighted the unbearable burdens faced by women during this period. The focus was primarily on the extensive labor required of them, particularly the double shift of working both outside and inside the home. However, both Soviet men and women lacked the necessary understanding of class analysis to recognize the class structure of household work as part of the problem and therefore as a potential area for change. Since the only perceived alternative to traditional feudal and ancient household structures, state-run collectivization of consumption, was deemed too costly by Soviet leaders, women were resigned to endure their traditional roles. The high divorce rate in the 1920s, often discussed but not fully understood, also relates to household class structures. The post-1917 revolutionary euphoria and new opportunities likely made women's stagnant position in traditional households increasingly intolerable. If eradicating exploitation was a key societal goal, its persistent presence in households likely became unacceptable, even if not explicitly identified as exploitation. Conflicts between husbands and wives were not just about the workload, but also, on a deeper level, about the class dynamics within which the work was performed. The rising divorce rates led to an increase in ancient class-structured households, which in turn created a myriad of social issues. Disputes over alimony, child support, and the psychological and physical well-being of family members. The implications of these issues on Soviet history were profound, and changes in household class structures could have significantly altered these rates and their societal impacts. A comprehensive analysis of the social costs of maintaining traditional household structures would include their effects on women's unequal participation in Soviet political and cultural life, enduring patriarchal norms, child development, and workers' productivity, among other aspects of Soviet development. The inability of Soviet leadership and society to recognize and address the class structures and conflicts within households meant that these issues could not be openly discussed or evaluated. Consequently, the 1920s saw a reinforcement of traditional household class structures that did not support the transition to communist class structures in other areas of Soviet society. A similar pattern of ignorance is seen in the Soviet approach to sexuality. After some open discussions in the 1920s, there was a shift in the 1930s where sex surveys disappeared. Sex education was removed from schools, and a strict moral code was enforced. The lack of understanding and open discussion around female sexuality led to significant personal issues, indirectly affecting productivity. This parallels the Soviet blindness to household class structures and their societal impacts. Goldman, 1993, describes what might be termed a historic compromise reached in the 1930s between the class structures of Soviet enterprises and households. The first and second five-year plans required a massive influx of women into the workforce, coupled with a drop in real wages. This movement strained the financial and emotional stability of families and households. To address the resultant issues, the state introduced large-scale daycare programs, while women were expected to maintain traditional family roles alongside their jobs. Rural women, in contrast, were further entrenched in their traditional household roles. Men were encouraged to fulfill their duties as heads of households and to meet their alimony obligations. However, this approach failed to address the underlying class contradictions in both urban and rural households, leading to continued issues such as widespread homelessness among children. The state's response to this ongoing problem was to criminalize homeless children, treating them as a pathological issue rather than a symptom of deeper societal problems. The June 1936 law in the USSR, which focused on family responsibility by penalizing alimony evasion, restricting abortion and divorce, solidified the traditional class structures in Soviet households and enterprises. This law formed part of a broader, historic compromise. In return for state-provided childcare, Soviet men and women were expected to adhere to traditional feudal and ancient household class structures. Men were to contribute part of their wages to the household, while their wives not only did the same, but also performed surplus household labor for their husbands to distribute. This arrangement aimed to secure women's and their children's labor for Soviet industrialization, while saving state resources for other uses, such as childcare facilities and industrial growth. This compromise was enveloped in a return to traditional family values and reliance on household class structures. As noted in a comprehensive survey of Soviet peasant life in the 1930s, Fitzpatrick 1994b, the household remained the fundamental unit in village life, despite legal changes. This situation provided stability in a rapidly changing USSR and shifted focus from labor and income issues to rebuilding the Soviet family as a safe haven. The compromise reinforced feudal and ancient class structures in Soviet households, distancing the USSR from its radical Bolshevik origins. No significant challenges to these household class structures emerged in either practice or theory. This compromise mirrored other concessions in Soviet society. For example, early plans to revolutionize rural medical care by replacing minimally trained feldshers with well-trained physicians were supported by Lenin. However, financial constraints from the NEP and the impact of agricultural collectivization led to these plans being scaled back, reinstating the feldsher in rural medical practice. As the 1930s progressed, state resources were increasingly allocated to industrialization, political purges, and defense, leaving households to fend for themselves with minimal support. Men's role as heads of households and women's roles in domesticity and motherhood were emphasized to compensate for low wages and the burden of household labor. While this strategy helped achieve industrial growth and wartime victory, it also resulted in strained family relationships and difficult living conditions. The exploitation and resentment of Soviet women within their households contributed to strained relations with their husbands and disruptions in family life. The intense workload and emotional toll led to issues like alcoholism, absenteeism, and low productivity in the workplace. The state's attempts to resolve these household crises through moral persuasion or consumer goods were unsuccessful. The class conflicts within households remained a significant issue throughout Soviet history. The transition to private capitalism in the former USSR may have been facilitated by the compatibility of feudal and ancient class households with capitalist systems. Alternative class scenarios are possible. The increasing burdens of private capitalism may lead to a reevaluation of household structures in Russia, similar to discussions on family values in the US. There's potential for a renewed interest in communist class-structured households, or even a move away from individual households as production sites. Understanding the USSR's class dynamics in households alongside enterprise dynamics is crucial for a comprehensive analysis of its history and might offer valuable insights for current and future societal challenges. The new economic policies of the 1920s. Let's explore the new economic policies, NEP, of the 1920s in the context of Bolshevik Russia. The period of war communism, marked by Bolshevik requisitions of food and raw materials, created substantial contradictions and resistance. This resistance necessitated a strategic pivot by Lenin, leading to the proclamation of the NEP in 1921. The NEP, in turn, produced its own set of contradictions, eventually leading to Stalin's decision to collectivize agriculture in the late 1920s. At the heart of these recurring difficulties were the efforts of farmers, both ancient and those leaning towards capitalism, striving to improve their situation. The state's approach was to appease agriculture while simultaneously giving preference to industry at the expense of agriculture. It's essential to understand that the logic underpinning the NEP mirrored that of war communism, although with significant changes in its mechanisms. During war communism, the state requisitioned agricultural output from farmers, often without any form of exchange or compensation. This form of requisitioning was a type of compulsory subsumed class revenue that farmers had to pay to the state. These requisitions supported the state's survival, especially militarily, but they also endangered the farmers' ability to maintain their class structures and, in some cases, their survival. Reacting to this, farmers could either work longer hours, reduce their consumption, or try to squeeze out more surplus, perhaps through partnerships. Another response was to pressure wives to perform more surplus labor within feudal households. All these responses, however, risked increasing class conflicts and tensions within households, impacting the viability of the farm. Initially, farmers tolerated these conditions, fearing the loss of their land if the Reds lost the Civil War. However, as requisitions continued, many farmers began hiding grain stocks or consuming animals vital for production, jeopardizing future harvests. By 1921, open revolts and building anger made it clear to Lenin and other Soviet leaders that a change was necessary. On the industrial front, there were class crises too. Workers in state capitalist enterprises faced reduced real wages due to food requisitioning problems. Their bargaining powers were diminished, and they faced increasing demands for productivity, leading to stress and exhaustion. This frustration was directed at various entities, including the state and the party. These class crises in both agriculture and industry threatened the stability of the Soviet system. Adding complexity to these crises was the fact that many new industrial workers had only recently left agricultural life. Their return to the farms was a potential risk if their working conditions in factories worsened. Besides these class issues, there was also a significant non-class issue following the revolution. The centralization of the appropriation of the industrial surplus in Vasenka's hands and the management of production in its sub-agencies led to opposition from those displaced or demoted by these centralizations. This opposition was not just about the nationalization of enterprises, but about how they would be managed. The transition from decentralized to centralized management in state capitalist industry didn't end the struggles. Conflicts over power and status within the bureaucracy persisted, impacting the class structure of the USSR. These struggles were different from class struggles, but they were interconnected and equally crucial in shaping Soviet history. The rapid centralization of Soviet state capitalism imposed a significant task of creating effective bureaucratic organization under extreme pressure, with inexperienced personnel. This led to disorganization, bottlenecks, inefficiencies, and conflicts at various bureaucratic levels. One of the central problems was the inadequacy of inputs for industrial enterprises, which were still expected to meet output quotas. So, as we delve into the complexities of the NEP era, we see a tapestry of class struggles, bureaucratic challenges, and a state striving to find its footing in a rapidly changing world. It's a period marked by conflict, adaptation, and the relentless pursuit of a new societal order. Relations between agriculture and industry. An overview in this lecture, we will explore the intricate relationship between agriculture and industry during the new economic policy, NEP period in the Soviet Union of the 1920s. The NEP was a strategic response by Lenin to alleviate the explosive situation created by war communism. It was designed to calm the near revolt of farmers and ease tensions among workers, surplus appropriators, and managers in various bureaucratic layers. While the NEP brought some relief, it also set in motion social changes that led to new contradictions and challenges. A critical question at the time was whether the NEP was reviving and encouraging a capitalist class in agriculture. This led to a debate. Should the NEP be continued to foster the supply of food and raw materials necessary for industrialization, or should it be replaced with a strategy that puts direct state pressure on farmers? This debate split into what was known as the right-wing and left-wing opposition. Interestingly, these ideological and organizational struggles were not just about agriculture or industry in isolation. They were about the broader goals of Soviet society, particularly the development of state industrial capitalism under the guise of building socialism and transitioning to communism. The NEP inherited a significant problem from war communism: how to ensure a steady flow of food, raw materials, and new industrial workers from agriculture without relying on requisitions. The NEP introduced grain taxes and allowed farmers to sell their produce in private markets, reintroducing market mechanisms that had been largely abolished. This change led to a renewed contradiction between state capitalist industry and private agriculture. The key question now was whether the mix of state and private market institutions could support the expansion of state capitalist industry, a central goal of Soviet socialism. In terms of class analysis, the NEP aimed to bridge the gap between the surplus appropriated from industrial workers and the state's essential industrial investments. However, the improved circumstances for farmers also meant that they were less inclined to reduce production as a response to state pressures. This easing of pressure on households also reduced the need for women to produce surplus labor to compensate for losses from requisitions. However, the coexistence of state and private markets meant that the state could never fully control the terms of trade between agriculture and industry. This dynamic affected both agricultural and industrial sectors, as well as the profits of private merchants, The netman. Throughout the NEP period, the so-called price scissors, the ratio of agricultural to industrial prices, generally remained unfavorable to agriculture. This situation allowed for more investment in state capitalist industry than would have been possible solely from industrial surplus and taxes. However, the improving terms of trade for farmers reduced these transfers over the decade, prompting Stalin to respond with agricultural collectivization. In summary, the NEP was a complex and evolving policy that sought to balance the needs of agriculture and industry in a rapidly changing Soviet society. It was a period marked by contradictions, debates, and strategic shifts that had profound implications for the future of Soviet socialism. The NEP in class and value terms. We examine the contradictions of the terms of trade policy, which were crucial during the NEP period, by utilizing Marxian concepts of value, surplus value, and market price. The gains and losses experienced by industry and agriculture depended on the relationship between prices and values in each sector of the economy. Due to the existence of two sets of markets and prices, private and state-administered, we must adjust our equations to account for both. This adjustment enables us to precisely identify the mechanisms and challenges of the NEP's terms of trade policies and their impact on class structures in both sectors. First, it's important to recognize an assumption underlying our analysis of value-price relations. The NEP period was generally marked by inflation across all commodities. As all prices increased, the terms of trade between industry and agriculture hinged on which sector's prices rose more significantly. Our approach links the terms of trade to a net value transfer from agriculture to industry through unequal exchanges between the sectors. These exchanges were unequal because the disparity between price and value differed in industry compared to agriculture. We will demonstrate that the prices of state capitalist industrial products tended to exceed their values more than the comparable excess in agricultural products. To concentrate on the unequal exchange mechanism of this net value transfer, we assume for simplicity that the values of industrial and agricultural products remained constant throughout the NEP. If labor productivity increased faster in industry than in agriculture, as is likely, our argument would only be strengthened. Our analysis encompasses both the emerging small capitalist farmers, kulaks, and the traditional farmers. The former were particularly significant as they provided a disproportionate share of the total marketed food and raw materials. The complex roles of both state and private merchants in mediating among different class structures are also included. To incentivize farmers to expand the marketed supplies of grains and raw materials, the NEP reintroduced private markets and prices, while also increasing the state-administered prices paid by state merchants for farm products. This dual market structure, particularly for grain, led to unique contradictions for the state and its capitalist industry. The state aimed to set grain prices high enough to boost marketed output, yet low enough to keep food affordable, and thereby maintain low industrial workers' wages. Without a private market, the state's grain price policy would still have faced conflicting forces. With both a private market and merchants, the state encountered insurmountable challenges in managing its internal terms of trade. As noted earlier, when state procurement prices and private market prices for raw materials and grains exceeded their values, private traditional and small capitalist farmers enjoyed a non-class revenue flow, NCR, in addition to the surpluses they appropriated within their respective class structures. This excess of price over value, an unequal exchange, accrued to farmers at the expense of both the state and private merchants purchasing their products. In the early NEP period, farmers benefited from this favorable exchange position. Moreover, when state set prices were lower than private market prices, farmers could shift supplies to private from state merchants, or speculate by retaining inventories in the hope that the state would raise prices to secure supplies. To maximize profits in its industrial enterprises, the Soviet state aimed to keep wages low by ensuring affordable food. Consequently, its state procurement prices for grain were typically lower than private market prices for most of the NEP period. The farmers' responses repeatedly compelled the state to reluctantly increase its prices. In contrast, the state did not set its procurement prices for agricultural raw materials much below private market levels. As a result, Soviet farmers often reallocated their production from grain to raw materials. This shift exacerbated the overall grain supply situation, ultimately contributing to the downfall of the NEP itself. The higher the state or private prices paid to farmers, the greater the costs for the state or private merchants handling this trade. These merchants' profits would be squeezed or eliminated unless they could reduce other costs, such as handling goods and bookkeeping, or increase the resale prices of agricultural products to their final consumers, which included state capitalist industries and individual wage earners. The state merchants, tasked primarily with grain collection, faced a challenge. They needed to purchase grain at the lowest possible cost for all the state's needs, yet they had to compete with private merchants. While private merchants, netmen, could efficiently manage their costs, the state's merchanting bureaucracy, burdened by socialist job security principles, struggled to compete. Consequently, the netmen prospered. Their wealth and ostentation, contrasting starkly with the surrounding economic hardship, became increasingly problematic for the egalitarian socialist image the Soviet regime projected. State merchants found it difficult to match the netmen's higher prices paid to farmers, as doing so would raise food costs and consequently industrial workers' wages. State officials pressured the state merchants not to follow this route, since it would diminish the surpluses appropriated from productive workers in state capitalist industry. The netmen's influence extended beyond their competition with state grain merchants and their conspicuous wealth. Although most grain and raw materials purchasing remain within the state procurement system, netmen dominated the markets where farmers purchased industrial products, either as farming inputs or consumer goods. They were the primary sellers of industrial goods in rural areas for most of the NEP period. This asymmetry, state merchants dominating wholesale markets as buyers of agricultural products, while private merchants dominated retail markets as sellers of industrial goods, created severe challenges for the state's overall economic development strategy. Eventually, this led the state to take over retail marketing, along with its collectivization of agriculture. Netmen purchased industrial goods from state capitalist industry at state-administered wholesale prices, which were always set to exceed their values per unit. Initially, netmen, more than state merchants, fulfilled this role as merchants for state capitalist industry. Given their other merchanting costs, netmen's profits then depended on reselling these state capitalist industrial products to traditional and capitalist farmers and wage workers at private market retail prices significantly higher than the wholesale prices paid by the netmen. The role of netmen in rural retail trade posed a new and risky dilemma for the state. For instance, if the state raised the wholesale prices of its industrial commodities above their values, generating additional revenue in its exchanges with the netmen could counteract this by increasing their retail prices to farmers at an even faster rate. This widening of the private retail wholesale price gap favored the netmen. Higher private prices charged to farmers undermined or sometimes reversed the incentives to produce and market more grain and raw materials. Thus, even when state procurement prices for these products were increased to stimulate farmers' production, the netmen's price hikes could undermine the state's stimulus. The netmen's actions affected the terms of trade, the scissors, that actually confronted the farmers. The Soviet leader Kamenev recognized this issue, referring to the new scissors which cut into pieces both our industry and our good relations with the peasantry. In response, the Soviet state repeatedly attempted to constrain the netmen's operations in private markets, risking further limitations on the already scarce flow of manufactures to farmers. Despite these risks, throughout the NEP period, particularly after 1925, the state expanded its retail operations and control over private retail trade and manufactures. The state gradually replaced the dominance of private merchants and prices with state merchants, and state set prices in the retail markets for industrial goods. However, the state simultaneously limited the production of light industrial goods meant for rural markets and individual consumption, favoring heavy industrial growth instead. The resulting shortages of agricultural inputs and consumer goods, especially in rural areas, maintained retail prices on what remained of free markets significantly above state-set retail prices. The state's reluctance to raise its retail prices of manufactures and its paradoxical decision to lower them led to a goods famine, as described by Nove, 1989, characterized by excess demand and long queues for manufactures. The resulting disincentive for farmers to supply more grain and raw materials was unsurprising. We can now summarize the NEP's complex impacts on the class structures in agriculture. Both traditional and small capitalist farmers gained non-class revenues, NCR, as they received rising state-set and private prices higher than the values of their products. However, both groups also had to pay out increasing portions of their surpluses, SSCP, to cover the rapidly rising prices of manufactured agricultural equipment and other inputs, such as fuel and fertilizers purchased from state merchants and netmen. The likewise rapidly increasing retail prices of manufactured consumer goods also consumed a larger share of individual farmers' personal incomes, adding pressure on traditional and small capitalist farmers. Because the terms of trade favored state capitalist industry over the NEP period as a whole, the overall net effect was, with few exceptions, to place both agricultural class structures and the broader agricultural population under significant strain. The farmers' traditional and small capitalist class structures gained less from high selling prices than they lost from the combination of taxes and high buying prices. Consequently, they lacked sufficient revenue to sustain their existence. What agricultural class structures and rural consumers lost, the Soviet state, its state capitalist industry and state merchants gained. We first consider state capitalist enterprises alone, then in combination with state merchants, and finally present the net state gains from taxes and the terms of trade between industry and agriculture, after eliminating internal transfer value flows between state enterprises and state merchants. Industrial enterprises received state-set wholesale prices above unit values for their manufactured goods, providing them with additional non-class revenues from sales to state and private merchants. State-set prices of raw materials, set above their values, imposed higher outlays on state capitalist industries to pay state and private merchants for these materials. Recall that unless merchants reduced their own profits or costs, the need to pay farmers higher raw material prices translated into higher prices charged to state capitalist industry. Such higher prices for inputs necessitated increased subsumed class distributions by state capitalist industries to the merchants. The state's manipulation of both industrial goods and raw materials prices enabled a net flow of value to benefit state capitalist industry, SVC, plus NCR greater than SSCPC. Throughout the NEP period, state capitalist industry gained at the expense of the ancient and capitalist class structures in agriculture. A more complete, albeit complex picture of state revenues and expenditures under the NEP includes the value flows of state merchants alongside those of state industrial enterprises. Focusing only on the terms of trade, the following state equation omits new taxes and debt on the revenue side, and state disbursements other than those associated with industrial enterprises and merchants on the expenditure side. SVC plus NCR for state enterprises, and NCR plus SSCRC plus SSCRA plus C. For state merchants show a net gain over SSCPC plus SSCPCERM for state enterprises, and Y plus X for state merchants. The first category, St. Ent, represents the value flows received by state capitalists from exploiting industrial workers, SVC, and unequal exchanges, NCR, with state and private merchants. The second category, St. Mer, represents the three sources of state merchant revenues: sales of industrial consumer goods and grains at state, set retail prices above their values, NCR. Sales of raw materials to state capitalist industry at state, set prices above their values, SSCRC. And sales of manufactured inputs to ancient and small capitalist farmers at state, set prices that exceeded their values, SSCRA plus C. On the expenditure side, the first bracket contains SSCPC, the disbursements of state capitalist industrial surpluses made to secure the growth of state capitalist industry, and SSCPCERM, highlighting the relationship of state capitalist industries with the merchants from whom they purchased raw materials. The second bracketed term, Y, represents state merchants' total expenditures to secure their non-class revenue flows (NCR), including the costs of merchanting and acquiring commodities. The category X stands for total expenditures to reproduce state merchants' subsumed class revenues. The inequality in the equation suggests that during the 1920s, the Soviet states' administered prices achieved a net inflow of revenue from its entire economic apparatus, both production and merchanting, enabling rapid economic recovery from the war and the growth of state capitalist industry at the expense of ancient and capitalist class structures in agriculture. The equation describes the overall direction and impact of price changes on value flows affecting the USSR's multiple class structures, but does not distinguish between flows within and outside the state. For instance, a rise in industrial enterprises SSCP-CERM on the expenditure side was offset by a rise in state merchants SSCR-C on the revenue side. These transfers of value may have been significant determinants of struggles within the state. Revising our equation to remove intrastate value flows, we focus on explaining why 1. The relation reached a critical conjuncture marking the end of the NEP period, and 2. The Soviet state replaced private with state merchants. The revised equation shows the revenue and expenditure categories previously introduced, highlighting the net gains in state capitalist industry and state merchants from the unequal exchanges entailed by the state-set retail prices of manufacturers rising faster than state-set wholesale raw material and grain prices paid to farmers. The Soviet state used these added value inflows for state capitalist industrial development, their socialism, at the deliberate expense of netmen and ancient and small capitalist farmers, their non-socialist elements. However, this progress was never smooth or secure, as the terms of trade shifted unevenly, yielding uneven flows of value into state capitalism and hampering its development. The recurring scissors crises of the 1920s and debates over industry's growth in relation to agricultural support illustrate the complexities and contradictions inherent in the NEP, highlighting the Soviet leaders' struggles to balance socialist growth with political and economic realities. A history of new economic policy contradictions. The contradictions of the new economic policy, NEP, became evident soon after the end of war communism. Initially, the terms of trade favored agriculture, peaking in spring 1922. State capitalist enterprises, desperate for working capital, sold industrial commodities at reduced wholesale prices to private merchants, known as netmen, cutting their non-class revenues from unequal exchange. The netmen resold these commodities at higher retail prices, boosting their profits. Meanwhile, prices for agricultural goods rose as farmers, facing increased demands, were either unable or unwilling to boost production. This led to higher grain prices paid to farmers, PCSW in the previous equation, reducing state revenues, and higher raw material prices, PSWRM in the same equation, increasing state enterprises' expenditures. The lifting of war communism's price controls also allowed farmers to sell to the highest bidder, either private or state markets, leveraging their market power. The revival of state capitalist industry after war communism paradoxically led to a crisis within itself, as the terms of trade moved against industry, reducing state revenues and increasing expenditures on raw materials. The Senka, the state industrial management body, reacted to these challenges by restructuring the industry and developing a new state-controlled merchant organization. State capitalist enterprises were reorganized into autonomous state industrial trusts, which could form commercial syndicates and set their own state-administered prices. This shifted the terms of trade even more against netmen and farmers, allowing trusts to enjoy higher revenues and growth. However, this led to declining real incomes for workers and ancient consumers, another unfavorable development. The terms of trade in 1923 were influenced by the farmers' response in 1921 and 1922, when favorable trade terms had led them to increase cultivation and market supply. This, however, turned the terms of trade against them, leading to the well-known 1923 scissors crisis in agriculture. The Soviet state intervened, fearing rural unrest and a decrease in marketable food and raw materials. Policies were implemented to tackle rising industrial prices, reducing loans to state capitalist enterprises, limiting syndicates' ability to increase industrial wholesale prices, importing selected manufacturers to boost domestic supply, and establishing a commission to increase industrial efficiency. The state aimed to raise productivity, thereby reducing the unit value of industrial goods. If wholesale prices were decreased less than the value reduction through productivity gains, state capitalist industries could still earn revenues from unequal exchanges with netmen. However, the state lowered wholesale prices for industrial goods more than productivity gains had reduced their values, leading to decreased industrial profits. To further appease agriculture, the state raised its procurement prices for agricultural goods and improved conditions for private capitalism in agriculture, including extended land leases and regular wage labor hiring. As a result, the scissors began to move back against state industry and merchants in 1924, reducing non-class revenues for industry and increasing subsumed class payments to farmers. Higher grain prices again threatened to raise retail food prices, putting pressure on wages and industrial surpluses. In response to the 1923 scissors crisis in agriculture, the 1924 grain harvest was poor, further raising grain prices, especially in private markets. The state initially set its procurement prices lower than rising private prices, but was eventually forced to increase them due to competition from private markets. The following years saw a continuation of this oscillating pattern, with the contradictions, debates, and fears it provoked. As long as private grain markets and merchants offered alternatives to state markets, the Soviet strategy for industry and socialism depended on ancient farmers, capitalist farmers, kulaks, and netmen. Despite victories for farmers in 1924 and good harvests in 1925 and 1926, the grain surplus delivered to the market did not grow as fast as Soviet leaders expected, necessary for industrial growth. This inadequacy, combined with other challenges in the relationship between industry and agriculture, was a catalyst for undermining the NEP and prompting the emergence of new class structures in agriculture. The terms of trade continued to oscillate, although exchanges between agriculture and industry became less unequal over time. The near closure of the price scissors in 1928-29 had significant implications for class and economic development, raising official anxiety. Without unequal exchanges, state capitalist industrial growth relied solely on surpluses appropriated from industrial workers, taxes, and limited foreign capital inflows. The slow growth in marketed grain quantities in the late 1920s, despite rising production and improving trade terms for growers, posed a critical challenge. The state's efforts to address grain shortages involved matching rising private grain prices and raising wages for workers to afford higher prices. This increased labor costs for state capitalist industry, combined with the loss of gains from unequal exchanges, put significant pressure on the state. The state faced the dilemma of pressing industrial employees for more work or higher taxes, or keeping wages down as food prices rose, risking worker hostility. The end of the 1920s saw mounting tensions in Soviet life, centered on the slowly growing supply of marketed grain, crucial for sustaining desired socialist industrial growth. A vicious cycle emerged. Investment in heavy industry limited growth in light industry and consumer goods production, leading to shortages that prompted farmers to withhold grain from the market. When grain prices rose and the state increased wages, workers often used the extra income to buy scarce industrial consumer goods, exacerbating the goods famine in state stores and leading netmen to raise private prices for manufactured goods and agricultural equipment. This further constrained farmers' marketed grain supplies, perpetuating the cycle. Disparities in access to scarce goods, with well-connected individuals obtaining them at low state, set prices, while others, mainly ancient and small capitalist farmers, had to pay higher private prices, undermined social solidarity. The shortages and poor quality of industrial consumer goods and manufactured agricultural inputs limited both the incentives and capacities for expanded grain production. Toward the decade's end, the issue of grain deliveries for Soviet industrialization emerged as a key obstacle to socialism's growth and survival. Soviet policy's class effects extended beyond state industry, rural agriculture, and the markets between them. Rural-produced industrial goods, often of equal or better quality than urban-produced state capitalist commodities, were plentiful in rural areas. Especially those produced within rural households by women were seen as comparable or superior to the relatively poor-quality state capitalist consumer goods. This rural handicraft production not only curtailed total grain production, but also kept more grain in rural areas and away from delivery to state capitalist industry. By producing little farm machinery and equipment, state capitalist industry exacerbated the grain supply problem. Farmers either produced equipment themselves, rented it from from kulaks or purchased it from village producers. While rural production of mostly ancient and feudal crafts offset the scarcity of industrial goods during the NEP, it proved a costly diversion of rural labor from grain production. In 1928, Stalin attributed the imbalance between grain demand and supply to the revolution's egalitarian land distribution, which had replaced large, efficient capitalist estates with a multitude of small, inefficient ancient farms. However, our approach considers the problem of grain supplies as overdetermined by multiple factors, including market incentives, weather, livestock, and the interactions between the NEP and the different class structures of Soviet industry, agriculture, and households. Stalin and other state officials focused on the non-socialist qualities of small private farms as the key determinant of the grain crisis, leading to the collectivization of agriculture. This eliminated small, private individual farms and kulaks, replacing them with larger collective and state farms more subordinated to state control. While collectivization gave the state more control, it did not solve the problem of the relationship between industry and agriculture. It extended state capitalism from industry to the new state farms, and while establishing communist class structures on many collective farms, also undermined those structures from the outset. The collectivization of agriculture, in the name of socialism, only made the transition from state capitalism to communism more elusive and distant for the Soviet people. Farmers until the end of the Soviet Union had been the second-class citizens, and the Russian grain output would not resurgent after the dissolution of the Soviet Union. Adjusting state industrial capitalism during the NEP, the Soviet state grappled with the complexities of private agriculture and its relationship with state capitalist industry. This period also saw significant reorganization within state capitalist industry itself. New laws and decrees facilitated the decentralization of the appropriation of state capitalist surpluses. Vasenka, previously a centralized appropriator and distributor of surplus values produced in state capitalist enterprises, shifted its role. Localized state capitalist boards of directors were now designated as the appropriators and distributors of these industrial surpluses. These boards had the autonomy to form trusts, sell products in both state and private markets, and engage in direct exchanges at mutually agreed upon prices. While the decentralized boards and trusts managed the appropriation and distribution of surpluses, Vasenka retained significant influence. It no longer directly managed the industrial surplus, but appointed the members of these boards and trusts as state officials. These appointees, acting as surplus appropriators and distributors, functioned as industrial capitalists on behalf of the state, with terminable powers granted through a charter. They operated state-owned means of industrial production, with the new laws allowing these boards and trusts to function as independent legal entities, separate from the state budget. These entities were responsible for paying wages to their hired labor and managed their material inputs and outputs, realizing the surplus value embodied in these commodities for their own accounts. The state directed them to generate their own profits. Vasenka also influenced how these decentralized entities distributed their surpluses. This included setting guidelines for the distribution of profits for various purposes, such as depreciation of fixed capital, bonuses, welfare for workers, payments to the state treasury, and retained funds for the board members or trustees. The NEP did not reintroduce private industrial capitalism to the USSR, but rather adjusted the centralization level within the existing state industrial capitalism framework. This adjustment involved periodic shifts, oscillating between centralization and decentralization. For example, initial decentralization under the NEP led to the formation of larger trusts, reintroducing a degree of centralization. These shifts in centralization, whether during Stalin's 5-year plans or post-war periods, often responded to significant challenges in the operation of state capitalist industry. Reforms typically involved alterations between more and less centralization, touted as solutions to industrial problems. Discussions about these reforms did not question the underlying class structure of Soviet industry, but focused on the degree of its centralization. The prevailing view was that the state's ownership and operation of industrial enterprises, controlled by the workers, constituted socialism, contrasting with the private nature of farms. The manner of producing, appropriating, and distributing surplus labor was not a focal point in Soviet analyses. The oscillation between centralized and decentralized forms of state capitalism under the NEP addressed some issues but exacerbated others. In certain political, cultural, and economic contexts, decentralization could have evolved into a push for a transition from state to private capitalism. However, the social conditions of the 1920s did not allow for such a movement to gain traction, though this changed in later decades, notably the 1970s. Under the NEP, the state began to denationalize small industries or workshops, allowing them to sever ties with the state and become new private production sites. Alongside the decentralization of state capitalist industry and support for private ancient and small capitalist class structures in agriculture and industry, the NEP fostered a private market functioning parallel to the state markets. The netmen involved in these private market exchanges not only accumulated significant merchant capital, but also connected various class structures within the USSR. Their actions, along with those of state officials and producers, influenced the Soviet economy's market dynamics, leading to instabilities typically associated with markets. These complex interactions within production and circulation, involving both state and private sectors, culminated in the scissors crises. The grain crisis of 1928 marked a turning point, highlighting that the successes of the NEP were overshadowed by new contradictions and problems that emerged. The path dependency of political apparatus can hardly be resolved without bloodshed. It would take multiple generations for one political decision to be fully removed from the bureaucrat's handbook. However, the Soviet Union never had the time to see revolution and new economic policy as a transition to state capitalism's development in Russia, and the 1917 revolution. It is widely acknowledged that capitalism took root in Russia and developed rapidly under the last czars. Our analysis leads to a further conclusion. The 1917 revolution did not abolish this capitalism. Rather than initiating a non-capitalist society, the Bolsheviks transformed private capitalism into state capitalism. During war, communism and the NEP, the new state, along with the Communist Party, successfully developed state capitalism by increasing industrial output, workforce, and capacity. This development was achieved by managing major contradictions within state industry and its relations with other class structures and non-class processes, political, cultural, etc., in Soviet society. Notably, participants, supporters, and critics alike perceived these efforts as building socialism, a progression toward communism. Preobrazhensky correctly identified that primary capital accumulation occurred in the USSR during the 1920s. However, he erred in labeling it socialist. It was, in essence, an accumulation preliminary to state capitalism. The extraction and sometimes destruction of surpluses from non-capitalist class structures to benefit the development of capitalist class structures was similar to processes observed in Marx's Capital. This transformation in the USSR mirrored transitions from non-capitalist to capitalist class structures seen in England, Germany, the United States, and other countries. While those transitions spanned centuries in the USSR, it occurred within mere decades. In these transitions, capitalist class structures often emerged from, conflicted with, yet depended on non-capitalist class structures. The USSR's contradictory transition, detailed in our chapters, parallels these historical patterns. The advent of the NEP was a response to the overwhelming contradictions of war communism in accumulating capital for state capitalist industry and the USSR's survival. When the NEP's contradictions similarly became overwhelming, collectivization of agriculture was introduced. This process largely eradicated private capitalist and ancient farmers, replacing them with collective and state farms. It was an effort to eliminate domestic class enemies in agriculture. Furthermore, the Soviet state's takeover of retail trade, initiated after 1925 and completed under Stalin, eliminated the netmen and gained control over key prices and the troublesome scissors movements that had previously hindered capital accumulation for state capitalist industrial growth. Collectivization and national planning were hoped to secure resources for the resumption of rapid state capitalist industrial growth. However, as the next chapter will show, collectivization introduced its own set of contradictions, crises, and challenges. Our analysis of war communism and the NEP reveals a complex array of different forms of state capitalist industry. Changes in non-class conditions, political, cultural, etc., overdetermined changes in the USSR's class structures. While state capitalism, capitalist class structures within state industrial enterprises endured, these structures interacted with changing political, cultural, and economic conditions, leading to various forms of state capitalism. The absence of markets under war communism, the emergence of state and private markets, and eventually the elimination of most private markets were significant non-class process changes that interacted with, and thus altered, Soviet state capitalism. Similar dynamics were observed in the distribution of political power among state bureaucracy levels and the party, as well as debates over primary accumulation, state-controlled markets, and socialist development. Changes in other non-capitalist class structures coexisting with Soviet state capitalist industry also influenced its form. Despite these changes in various forms of state capitalism, they never resulted in a transition from state to private capitalism or from capitalist to a different class structure in industry. The transformations of the 1930s. Welcome to today's episode of our podcast, where we delve into the transformative decade of the 1930s in the Soviet Union. This period marked a significant shift back to a more centralized form of state capitalist class structure in industry, echoing the patterns we saw during war communism. Instead of the numerous state capitalist surplus appropriators in the decentralized industrial trusts of the NEP era, we saw a consolidation of power. The Council of Ministers centralized appropriation at the highest level of the state bureaucracy, and the size of the surplus they controlled expanded massively over the decade. Capitalist surpluses appropriated in state industrial enterprises became a primary revenue source for the Soviet state's expenditures, surpassing agriculture's relative importance in financing the state's demand for revenues. Let's break this down further. First off, industrial employment saw a meteoric rise in the 1930s, driven by an unprecedented burst of capital accumulation. This rapid growth was also fueled by increased managerial pressures, which raised the intensity of industrial labor. Additionally, a squeeze on industrial workers' real wages, coupled with their rising productivity, effectively reduced the value of their labor power. This resulted in a significantly enhanced surplus appropriated from workers in state capitalist industries, giving the Council of Ministers new avenues to pursue their priority objectives. Turning our attention to agriculture, the changes here were, in classical Marxian terms, revolutionary. State intervention transformed a vast number of private ancient and small capitalist farmers into members of collective farms. Most of these farmers were either persuaded or coerced into joining these collectives. A small number transitioned into wage laborers on state farms, which were organized in a similar vein to state industrial enterprises, effectively as state capitalist farms. This was a period marked by immense resistance, with millions suffering imprisonment, death, or other forms of repression. Interestingly, many who joined collective farms began to collectively appropriate and distribute the surpluses they produced. This marked the first and only mass appearance of a communist class structure in Soviet history, occurring in agriculture and not in industry, and in the 1930s, not during the revolutionary decade after 1917. Now, let's talk about the new complexities and contradictions that arose. Despite the industrial enterprises generating significantly increased surpluses in the 1930s, the state's industrial growth plan required even more revenues. The state once again looked towards agriculture to secure these extra resources. However, with collectivization, it meant tapping into surpluses produced by largely communist agriculture. If the state were to manipulate the terms of trade against agriculture, it would no longer be exploiting ancient and capitalist farmers, but the collective farms, the so-called socialist achievement of Soviet agricultural policy. This maneuver threatened to undermine the very communist class structures it had established. To add to the complexity, state policies in the 1930s both weakened and strengthened agricultural communism. One notable policy was allowing collective farmers to work individual, private plots on the collective farms, thereby reintroducing ancient class structures that collectivization aimed to eliminate. Furthermore, the state's establishment of a new tractor industry to raise agricultural productivity and its allowance for local private markets to resume, albeit under certain restrictions, added layers of contradiction to the Soviet agricultural scene. These developments exemplified the ongoing tensions and contradictions within the Soviet Union's state capitalist and communist class structures. As we move further into our exploration of this era, we'll see how these contradictions played out and shaped the trajectory of Soviet history. Stay tuned for our next episode, where we'll dive deeper into the aftermath of these transformations and their lasting impact. Thanks for joining me today on this journey through one of the most fascinating periods of the 20th century. New complexities and contradictions. In the 1930s, the Soviet Union's state capitalist class structure and industry returned to a more centralized form, akin to its structure under war communism. A smaller number of officials in the Council of Ministers now appropriated and distributed the industrial surplus, which had significantly increased over the decade. Industrial surpluses became a key revenue source for the Soviet state, surpassing the relative importance of agriculture. Industrial employment surged due to a burst of capital accumulation and increased managerial pressure on labor intensity. Real wages of industrial workers decreased while their productivity rose, leading to a greater surplus appropriated from them. Agriculture experienced revolutionary changes, with private ancient and small capitalist farmers transforming into collective farm members. Many farmers joined collective farms under persuasion or coercion, while a minority became wage laborers on state farms. Resistance to these agricultural class transformations led to imprisonment, death, or other forms of repression for millions. Collective farms began to appropriate and distribute surpluses collectively, marking the first mass appearance of a communist class structure in Soviet agriculture. Despite increased industrial surpluses, the state's industrial growth plan required even more revenues, leading to reliance on agriculture. Collectivization meant tapping into surpluses produced by largely communist agriculture, potentially undermining collective farm survival. State pricing policies weakened agricultural communism, while other policies like allowing private plots and local markets helped strengthen it. Collective farmers used private plots to earn extra revenues, which could either strengthen ancient class structures or increase family consumption. Once collective farms met state quotas, they could sell excess produce in private markets at higher prices, aiding their sustainability. The introduction of machine tractor stations, MTS, that rented tractors to collective farms helped offset early declines in farm productivity, but also required farms to deliver a portion of their surpluses as rental fees. Increased surplus appropriation in state capitalist industry and surpluses siphoned from communist agriculture pressured other societal areas, such as feudal households, where women were pressed to produce more surpluses. State welfare programs, such as factory meals, subsidized apartments, and medical care, aimed to compensate for the burdens on industrial workers and collective farmers. The emergence of a large state bureaucracy was tasked with organizing and directing changes in industry and agriculture, drawing a portion of the surplus produced in collective farms. The bureaucracy, along with the Communist Party, police, and military, formed part of a growing apparatus of unproductive workers in Soviet society. The 1930s saw economic growth alongside political and cultural transformations, but also retained or deepened societal fragility and new contradictions. Household strife, prioritization of private plot farming over collective farm work, and the burden of producing more capital goods at the expense of consumer goods led to simmering social tensions. The state and Communist Party under Stalin increasingly intervened to maintain society, escalating from propaganda to political threats and force. State and party interventions extended to suppressing criticisms and theoretical differences, leading to Stalinism's terrors and cultural norm of demonizing any potential critics. Despite repression, a tradition of questioning and debating alternative policies persisted in Soviet society, particularly regarding industrialization's pace and the balance between industry and agriculture. State and party interventions also created a new culture, emphasizing sacrifices for building a modern socialist and industrial USSR, symbolized by construction sites, factories, and industrial jobs. After Lenin's reign, Stalin assumed the mantle of socialism's father. He aimed to fulfill the Bolshevik promise of socialism, characterized by rapidly growing modern industry, collective farming, rational state planning, and increased collective consumption for a fully employed workforce. Stalin fervently promoted the notion that socialism, essentially equated with collectivization in agriculture, and five-year industrial plans, was being realized. His commitment to socialism in one country starkly contrasted Trotsky's perspective, Deutscher 1968, 281-293. With Stalin's ascendancy over Trotsky, the official stance shifted. Soviet socialism would no longer wait for socialist revolutions in the West. Instead, it would proudly pave the way for revolutions in other capitalist countries. As Deutscher eloquently states, it is her destiny to become the center of a new civilization, 1968-293. This idea of socialism actualizing in the USSR solidified Stalin's position. To the extent that Soviet citizens embraced this idea, it became an integral part of the national ethic. Opponents or even critics of collectivization, the five-year plans, or their implementation methods were branded as anti-socialist and against the emerging new civilization. Such undesirable elements were systematically removed from collectives, factories, the arts, the state apparatus, and the party. In a campaign against those deemed internal enemies, the promotion of nationalism masked the suppression of class and non-class divisions. Stalinism's national ethic fostered a collective ethos and pride in Soviet modernism, often motivating workers, collective farmers, new bureaucrats, and party members. The nationalism justified the state's suppression of oppositional views and ongoing conflicts. The bureaucracy was tasked with ensuring various class structures played their planned roles, while workers were driven to maximize agricultural and industrial outputs. Their collective and often heroic efforts would later contribute to the USSR and General Stalin's victory in the Great Patriotic War. In terms of class, the cultural milieu of the 1930s helped to secure a key condition for the state's relentless drive to increase the exploitation rate of industrial workers and extract more value from communist collective farmers. Despite its industrial successes, rising grain and raw material surpluses, effective nationalist appeal, and purges of real and imagined critics, Stalin's state never fully controlled the contradictions and tensions caused by the radical changes in agriculture and industry. As this chapter reveals, each control attempt, whether successful or not, spawned new contradictions and tensions within the social formation. However, the regime's inability to control these consequences, though worrisome and threatening to its policies, ironically worked in their favor. For instance, by centralizing the appropriation and distribution of industrial surplus value in the Council of Ministers, Stalin allowed local subsumed class managers some control over collective farms, industrial enterprises, and even state retail stores. This centralization necessitated a vast planning bureaucracy to implement the council's decisions. Nevertheless, centralized economic planning led to misallocations, resource wastage, and inefficiencies. These issues drove local communist and capitalist managers to engage in covert deals, bribery, and bartering to acquire necessary materials and goods, often delayed or unavailable through the official plan. By acting independently, managers could operate and expand the USSR's communist and capitalist class structures, even as they bypassed central planning, paradoxically undermining those very structures. Another complexity and contradiction emerged in the state's successful drive to increase industrial workers' productivity through heightened labor intensity. Workers responded by demanding and to some extent gaining more control over their factory life. This mirrored the restoration of private plots and markets in collectivized agriculture. Empowered workers sometimes made achieving managers' production goals more challenging. Thus, while the state's pressure and control over industrial labor were effective, they also necessitated partial worker empowerment, potentially threatening productivity. The state's failures to completely control the workers might have inadvertently benefited industrial capital accumulation, as workers produced more surplus while compensating themselves with increased workplace power. Communism in agriculture. While no analysis of Soviet collective farming that we found treats its class structures in surplus terms, there are many other analyses available. These typically focus on one or both of two specific political processes: the distribution of power between central and local state officials over the work and political lives of collective farmers, and the distribution of ownership rights among the state, the collective, and the individual farm family over the means of production used on collective farms. Such political, rather than surplus-focused, theorizations are prevalent within Soviet Marxism itself. For instance, many official and unofficial formulations predominantly defined collectives according to the extent of collective ownership, socialization of the means of production, and secondarily according to the presence of collective consumption of meals and housing. Davies 1980, 68. Lewin 1975, 110 to 111. Daub 1966, 223. This perspective differentiated the three main types of collective farms: communes, artels, and toes, by their ownership rules. The toes, or fellowship for joint cultivation, was considered the least socialized, as most implements and animals remained privately owned with only the land being collectively farmed. Wesson 1963, 7-8. The Soviet preference for the artel in their collectivization efforts reflected the view that ownership, socialization, of land, implements, and draft animals constituted the essence of socialism in agriculture. Consider Stalin's 1929 speech on agrarian policy. The collective farm as a type of economy is one of the forms of socialist economy. There can be no doubt whatever about that. Stalin 1952, 404. He stated that collective farms function on land which belongs to the state, in a country where the means of production belong to the state. Ibid. 406. This speech was a direct response to economist Larin, who viewed the newly formed collectives as transitional structures because the means of production belonged not to the state, but to a collectivity of private farmers, Davies 1980, 85, 86. Full socialization, according to Lauren, would only be achieved when collectives became state enterprises. Despite their differences, both Lauren and Stalin based their definitions of socialism on specific distributions of ownership. Similarly, critic Moshe Lewin likened collectivization to a return of serfdom due to the state's power over the collective farms, suggesting a throwback to pre-1861 conditions. Lewin 1985, 183. Although this might be more rhetorical than precise, it highlights the dominant power-focused definitions of collectives, socialism, and related concepts. Our inquiry, however, focuses on different questions: who produced, appropriated, and distributed the surpluses in the collectives? And how were these class processes organized? To whom and for what purposes were these distributions made? Our research indicates that the working members of the collective often functioned as the appropriators, and hence the distributors of the surpluses they collectively produced. These farms' working members, not a centralized agency like the Council of Ministers or local Soviet officials, were the officially designated collective entity that appropriated and distributed its produced surpluses. From a class theoretical perspective focused on how surplus labor is organized, we conclude that many collective farms were indeed communist. Their communist class structure was notably different from the class structures we found prevalent in state industries, capitalist, and households, feudal and ancient. Likely for the first time in history, collectivization liberated masses of farmers from exploitation and bare subsistence, organizing them instead to partake in a communist class structure, to collectively receive the fruits of their collective efforts. The failure to understand or recognize this basic change in class structure in its surplus dimensions undermined its durability and potential appeal. The political abuse, violence, and suffering that accompanied it had similar effects. Evidence also suggests that many collective farms eventually lost, or perhaps never had, communist class structures. In these instances, a subgroup of members, as opposed to the entire collectivity, appropriated the collective farm's surplus. This could happen through various means, such as elected officials transforming their roles into self-perpetuating positions akin to a board of directors of a private capitalist corporation, local officials or party members usurping the position of surplus appropriators, or the collectivity unknowingly ceding the appropriator role to a subgroup of its members. Due to the lack of sensitivity to class and surplus labor terms in the empirical evidence on collective farms, distinguishing communist from other class structures is often challenging. However, our discussion primarily focuses on those collective farms with communist class structures due to their prevalence and our particular interest in communist class structures and their relationship to the history of the USSR. In exploring the class theoretical aspects of collective farms, we utilized existing literature, laws, contemporary speeches and debates, and reports from collective members as covered in the press. Our goal was to understand the internal functioning of these farms, particularly how they organized surplus labor, its production, appropriation, and distribution. Our findings center on two main points. Firstly, the proceeds of the collective farm's crop, whether sold at compulsory prices to the state or on private markets, initially belonged to and were appropriated by the members as a collective. Secondly, the collective also distributed the surplus portion of these proceeds, although influenced by orders from both local and distant Soviet officials. Davies's research supports this view, noting that each collective farm, not any individual farmer, centralized ministry, or decentralized trust or syndicate, was socially designated to receive the revenues upon sale of the crops. These revenues formed the financial base for the collective's expenditures, with a significant part going into a savings account for securing various conditions necessary for the collective's reproduction. Such communist class structures presented a challenge to state officials, but not in terms of who ultimately owned the means of production. Instead, the state had to contend with a class of communist surplus appropriators. The collective farm had its own goals, necessities, and rights in determining the size and distribution of its surpluses. The Soviet state's primary commitment to expanding state capitalist industry now faced a unique class problem, defined by the specific structure and dynamic of private, non-state communist agriculture. Evidence of communist class structures on many collective farms is also found in personal accounts of collective farm operations. For example, Beloved's work on a collective farm and his subsequent writings illustrate the importance of state pressures on farm collectives. The state applied pressure because the entire crop initially belonged to the collective that produced it. This ownership structure differentiated collective farmers from state industrial workers and state farm workers. The state's intervention to direct some surplus distributions from the communist surplus appropriated by the collective itself was a display of power, but different from appropriating and distributing surplus itself. Despite the state's exertions of power over communist collective farms and the challenges to their reproduction from state-mandated surplus distributions, the state also supported private communist collective farms in various ways. This included legislating and enforcing statutes governing the collective farms' functions and assets, and establishing decrees for periodic meetings to make major economic decisions. However, these laws also had contradictory effects. While they secured farmers access to means of production they had previously lacked, they also largely eliminated, except for private plots, the potential for private gain. Private individuals on collective farms could not use means of production to appropriate surplus labor from others. Additionally, the productivity benefits from the collective use of such means often vanished into the hands of the state through mandatory procurements, price manipulations, tractor rents, and taxes. Thus, the communist collectivity was restrained from benefiting from its own productivity gains. Given these constraints, it's not surprising that many farmers resisted the state's collectivization program, both passively and actively, at its inception and thereafter. For many members, their collective farms seemed little more than forced deprivations of their private property and simple mechanisms for the state to extract large portions of their output. The state and party labeled this socialism, citing the elimination of private property and their control over the state-managed economy. However, many collective farmers found little to celebrate in such a version of socialism. Neither Soviet officials nor collective farmers recognized how the processes of producing, appropriating, and distributing surplus labor defined the distinction of communism from any kind of exploitation. As a result, potential economic, cultural, and political benefits that could have arisen from an awareness of communism in surplus terms were lost. Unable to conceptualize, let alone disseminate, the issue of class in terms of surplus labor, Soviet political, economic, and cultural leaders failed to leverage the revolutionary change they had created in their society. On the issue of class, they were as theoretically underdeveloped as the supposedly backward farmers they sought to manage. Neither the officials nor the farmers could envision how Soviet individuals and institutions might have altered their behaviors in economically productive ways if such class consciousness had been widely developed. The history of the 25,000ers illustrates the contradictions faced by communist class structures in collective farms. These young, dedicated, and skilled cadres were sent to the collective farms by the party to introduce the concept of communism to the peasants. On the farms, they presented utopian visions of a better life, social ascendancy for all workers, and the impending arrival of social democracy and equality. Their enthusiasm and the relevant statutes contributed to fostering communist class structures on many collective farms. However, the cadres' theories and actions also inadvertently undermined the class structure they aimed to support. Influenced by party teachings, they believed that agricultural communism involved extending the socialism already present in industry. Viola, 1987, 153-154. They envisioned organizing surplus labor in collective farms in a manner similar to Soviet factories, effectively creating an exploitative class structure where some members would appropriate surpluses produced by others. Additionally, they aimed to replicate the successes of the Soviets' Industrial Revolution on these farms, focusing on increasing labor intensity and productivity. Consequently, the 25,000ers unintentionally supported both communist and capitalist class structures within the collective farms. Two distinct communal traditions also influenced collective farms. The first was derived from the Mir, an older institution, and the second from agrarian communes established post-1917 revolution. These traditions shaped the farm's communist class structures in contrasting ways. The Mir tradition, which involved self-governing peasants periodically redistributing land among households, supported the communist class structure by legitimizing the powers of local collectives. However, it also conflicted with communist structures, since the Mir traditionally facilitated each peasant owning their farm, a concept disrupted by collectivization which reduced private individual farming. Although the Artel replaced the commune as the preferred organizational form for Soviet collectivization, the underlying ideology of the commune, especially regarding collective surplus appropriation, largely persisted. The shift to artels saw the abandonment of communal concepts like collective housing and dining, and completely socialized ownership of production means. However, the practice of collective members fully participating in managing and benefiting from their collective labor remains central to communist culture in many collective farms. The sustainability of communist class structures on collective farms also hinged on improving productivity. By consolidating individually owned lands, animals, and tools, and by introducing tractors, via the MTS, the farms significantly increased labor productivity after 1934. These larger farms allowed for new cooperation and division of labor, further boosting productivity. Newly trained state managers within each collective and the local MTS facilitated this development and intensified work pace, positively impacting productivity. State policies supporting the productivity of collective farms also aided the preservation of communist class structures within them. However, other state strategies like pricing policies favored ancient class structures on private plots over the collective's communist structure. Like during the NEP era, farmers were incentivized to produce fur and sell on the private market, although this was also restricted and constrained by the state. In the 1930s, unlike the 1920s, private merchants were largely absent, compelling farmers to also act as merchants in local private markets. The 1930s Soviet farmer faced internal conflict, embodying two divergent farming identities, one as a member of the communist class structure in the collective farm, and the other as an individual in the private plot's ancient class structure. Farmers, newly integrated into collective farms, juggled these dual roles, but the resulting contradictions and struggles in Soviet agriculture were not recognized or addressed as class conflicts over the organization of surplus labor. The lack of class-based thinking in Soviet socialism, which overlooked the specifics of surplus labor production, appropriation, and distribution, allowed these class contradictions to deepen with minimal interference from state policy. This oversight ultimately threatened the goals of collectivization, establishing communism in agriculture, and sustaining rapid state industrialization. Our analysis of the 1930s Soviet social formation uses simple value equations to highlight key aspects: the communist class structure on collective farms, how the state supplemented its revenue from state capitalist industries with proceeds from communist agriculture, and the interaction of ancient and communist class structures on the farms. Our notation for communist class structure value flows is C-co plus V-co plus S-V-co equals W-co, where C-co represents the production means, V-co the value of labor power, what workers receive for individual consumption, and S-V-co the surplus value collectively received by the farmers. These components form the total value of the crop, W-co, also seen as the collective farm output's cost of production. The Soviet state's intervention in these class structures primarily involved mandating specific harvest portions to be sold to state agencies at controlled prices and pressuring the general meeting to allocate their surplus, SV-co, for replenishing collective farm funds. This differed from war communism requisitions, as the state paid for obligatory deliveries at set prices. After 1932, farms could legally sell remaining harvest on private markets post-obligatory deliveries to the state. A more detailed value equation for collective farms is available in Appendix A of this chapter. A crucial issue is the price paid by state merchants for obligatory deliveries from collective farms. Some argue these prices were below the collective's production costs. Lewin 1985, 169 to 170, Volin 1970, 251, Fitzpatrick 1994b, 72 and 129, implying an unequal exchange by the state, detrimental to the communist class structures. Conversely, others suggest that state procurement prices rose in the early 1930s, possibly exceeding their values, effectively subsidizing the communist class structures. No conclusive evaluation of these claims is possible. However, the swift rise in industrial goods prices purchased by farms from the state and the resurgence of the goods famine in rural areas in the 1930s had a significant impact on the exchanges between state merchants and collective farms. The question of how the Soviet state priced collective farm products is crucial. Observers like Lewin, 1985, Volin, 1970, and Fitzpatrick, 1994b, suggest that these prices were often below the collective's production costs. If true, this would mean that the Soviet state was engaging in an unequal exchange, offering less money for the products than their actual worth. This could have significantly harmed the communist class structures on the farms. On the flip side, there's evidence that state procurement prices might have actually risen, potentially subsidizing the communist structures. However, no definitive conclusion can be drawn on this matter. Two other significant factors influence the situation. Firstly, the prices of industrial goods purchased by the collective farms from the state rapidly increased. This was partly due to a shortage of such goods, reminiscent of the 1920s goods famine, causing prices to soar both in state and private markets. This put financial pressure on the communist class structures of the farms. Secondly, the products from private plots on the farms, sold in regulated markets, fetched much higher prices. This disparity in pricing systems financially favored the ancient class structures of the private plots over the communist structures of the collective farms. Dobb 1966, Bakov 1947. Due to these pricing dynamics, collective farmers were likely to shift their focus from the collective communist to the private ancient farming activities. The resulting financial strain led to reduced collective farm expenditures, including essentials like seeds and fertilizers, sometimes even contributing to famine conditions. The state's inconsistent policies added to the complexity. For instance, while the state initially fixed supply quotas for collective farms, it later allowed them to sell excess produce in local markets. However, when the fixed quotas were not met, and crops were diverted to uncontrolled markets, the state responded by reinforcing and strictly enforcing higher quotas. The fluctuating policies and economic pressures had profound impacts. Rising prices of industrial goods, combined with lowered procurement prices and increased costs of grain production, led to a severe economic strain on the collective farms, culminating in the famine of 1933. In response, the state shifted its focus, producing more tractors to increase farm productivity and accepting private plots and trading. This complex situation was further complicated by the different experiences of male and female farmers. Men primarily derived income from the collective's communal labor and private plots, while women also contributed surplus labor within their households' feudal class structures. The disparity in their experiences highlighted gender inequalities and tensions within the Soviet agricultural system. The collective farm's survival largely depended on the private plots, which helped sustain the communist class structures despite the challenging conditions. However, the constant movement of trade terms against the collective farms meant that the benefits from private plots and trade did not fully offset the state's pressures on the farms. In summary, the Soviet state's agricultural policies of the 1930s, while aimed at supporting the collective farms, also inadvertently undermined their communist class structures. This instability and the shifting policies contributed to the eventual economic difficulties and collapse of the USSR's agricultural system. Private and public land dilemma was so classic. The most American experience was Southern plantation. When slaves finished working in their master's farm, they can return home and help themselves through household production and work on their homestead land. They can raise chicken or grow corn. In the Middle Ages, serfs must tend their lord's land before they can grow their own wheat. This is a signifier of agriculture production without land ownership. Their labor becomes their rent. They must pay rent for basic subsistence farming. To quote, slavery and subsistence economy. A variety of fruits and vegetables were grown in the gardens, including beans, peas, collard greens, corn, squash, and pumpkins, onions, okra, potatoes, including sweet potatoes, watermelons, and muskmelons. Poultry were the most common livestock raised by slaves, though many also raised pigs and goats. Archaeological evidence indicates that slaves harvested a wide range of wild species. At Saragossa Plantation near Natchez, bones of wild animals discovered within the slave quarters area indicated that slaves there regularly hunted and fished for wild food, including opossum, deer, turtle, gar, sucker, and catfish. The WPA slave narratives offer evidence that the food resources grown, raised, hunted, fished, and gathered by the slaves provided a basis on which they entered an informal market economy. Many sold surplus food goods to their masters, to overseers, or at markets, and were allowed to keep the proceeds of their sales, which they used to purchase other goods. Former Mississippi slave Pete Franks reported saving $10 from selling vegetables grown in his garden, which he used to buy lots of pretties. State capitalism and industry. Soviet industrial successes in the late 1920s and 1930s are well documented. Dobb 1966, ch. 10-12, Nov 1989, ch. 8 and 9, Harrison 1994, ch. 3, Gregory and Stewart 1998, ch. 5. The following table summarizes industrial growth over this decade, average annual percentage growth rates, 1928 to 1940. Rolled metal steel production, 11.2%, pig iron production, 12.6%, industrial capital accumulation, 12.3%, industrial employment 7.0%, capital per worker in industry 5.3%, electric power 18.9%, Tractor production, 30.0% annual growth rates exceeding 10% in iron and steel production reflect the priority of heavy industry in the Soviet five-year plans that began in 1928. This remarkable industrial expansion was accompanied by increased mechanization. The capital-labor ratio in industry rose by 5% annually. Furthermore, rapid growth in electric power generation and tractor production indicates the structural changes that transformed urban and rural lives. However impressive, these growth rates do not tell the full story of successful state capitalist industrial expansion. The USSR acquired a significant capital goods sector with modern industrial complexes in chemicals, metal fabricating, and engineering. Daub 1966, 281, Davies 1994, 143 to 154. For example, while heavy industry accounted for 33.1% of the total manufacturing value added in 1928, by 1937 it was 62.7%. Gregory 1990, 29. The industry's proportion of the net national product rose from 28 to 45% between 1928 and 1937. Gregory and Stewart 1998, 87. This development placed the USSR among the world's leading industrial capitalist nations. During World War II, Germany and the United States during the Cold War encountered the achievements of Soviet industrialization. The cost of financing this unprecedented industrialization had to be met domestically, as significant foreign aid or lending was unavailable. Moreover, the USSR's industrial capital accumulation accounted for only a part of its expenditures from and hence demands upon the surplus its economy generated. In addition to industrial growth, the state was also rapidly increasing expenditures on a state bureaucracy, the Communist Party, a modern military apparatus, and the provision of many free or subsidized collective consumption goods. These included public education, health facilities, transportation, and even meals for some industrial workers. The revenues enabling such state expenditures derived chiefly from 1. An increased rate of exploitation of ever more industrial workers, 2. Terms of trade favoring industry against agriculture, and 3. Manipulations of wholesale and retail prices. These sources of state revenues were also indicators of what threatened Soviet society, increasingly exploiting industrial workers while also squeezing farmers and workers by imposing unequal exchanges upon them, produced dangerous levels of discontent in Soviet society. The state responded in part with economic interventions, providing free public goods to at least partially offset declining real individual incomes, allowing private plots and markets, offering industrial jobs to those leaving the countryside, increasing employment in the state bureaucracy, and so on. Discontent also prompted the state's political interventions, police terror, and the Gulag, to suppress first actual and then potential unrest, increasingly labeled as anti-Soviet. The state also intervened heavily in Soviet culture. Officials and others produced and disseminated images celebrating current economic policies as expressions of national pride. Rapid industrialization became the definitive symbol of the USSR's break with historical backwardness. Opposition to rapid industrialization or its domestic costs became synonymous with subjection to foreign jealousies and intrigues against Soviet ascendancy. Fear grew among the Soviet masses as proliferating warnings about foreign capitalist aggression escalated to hunts for its possible internal allies. All kinds of cultural production, often organized and subsidized by the state and the party, were pressed into service. Industrial construction, nationalist pride, and fear of foreign and domestic wreckers intertwined as major themes of literature, films, music, and painting. They helped to rationalize and justify the necessity of workers' reduced individual incomes and consumption despite their rising productivity levels. Personal sacrifices were protecting the growing achievements of Soviet socialism. The state's economic, political, and cultural interventions in the 1930s sought to sustain its top priority of a rapidly growing state capitalist industry, a subordinated communist and ancient agriculture, and an even more subordinated mix of feudal and ancient households. Individual citizens negotiated stressful lives among these multiple, fragile, and unstable class structures. Tensions within and among the interdependent class structures added problems for state policy, since they threatened its concept of socialism. The state's responses, whether or not they solved those problems, added new contradictions, strains, and new problems in the endless dialectic that framed the class history of the 1930s. We may begin to explore that dialectic by considering the flow of food and raw materials from the countryside into the cities. State merchants bought them from the collective farms at state-set prices roughly equal to their values or costs for food and sometimes exceeding their values for raw materials. Under the rationing, which lasted through 1935, the merchants resold food crops to industrial workers in cities at variously higher prices. The price difference yielded the state merchants' incomes. Price policies were never altogether clear, nor consistently applied. The evidence suggests that the state merchants sold many grains and even raw materials at official prices set higher than the procurement prices they paid to the collective farms. However, the merchants also sold these items often at still higher unofficial prices, referred to as commercial prices, under certain demand conditions and/or when special ad hoc circumstances, apparently politically motivated, made that possible. Once rationing was eliminated, the price situation changed. The post-1935 official prices for the grains and raw materials resold by state merchants remain much higher than what they had paid to the collective farms. But now the price difference had two components. One part yielded income to the merchants. The second, the turnover tax, yielded income directly to the state. The turnover tax also served to soak up excess demand in the market, thereby roughly equilibrating supply and demand. In these ways, the state manipulated wholesale and retail prices in the grain trade to add to its resources, by taking the state merchants' profits and collecting the turnover taxes. The burden of providing these resources to the state fell ultimately on industrial workers' real wages, what their money wages could actually purchase. In other words, a retail scissors. The ratio of retail to wholesale prices remained open against workers throughout the decade. In the controlled raw material trade, state merchants purchased them from collective farms at rising wholesale prices that sometimes exceeded unit values. From the evidence, we surmise that state merchants resold these raw materials to state capitalist industrial enterprises at little more than their wholesale prices, although at times they likely managed to sell them at even higher unofficial prices. Hence, for trade in raw materials, state merchants passed on to industrial enterprises any excess of their prices over values. To that extent, the state industrial enterprises bore the ultimate burden of any excess of raw materials prices above the values paid to the collective farms. That excess amounted to another demand claim upon, i.e., subsumed class payment from the surpluses generated in the state capitalist industries, and so may have detracted from the funds available for industrial growth. The ancient class structures on the private plots accounted for most of the trade in uncontrolled markets. They gained both before and after the elimination of rationing because they could sell their food products at free market prices far above their unit values. Indeed, the latter were declining because of rising productivity on the private plots. Industrial workers bore most of the burden of this unequal exchange since they purchased most of the scarce meat and dairy products, vegetables, and fruits in the uncontrolled markets. Squeezing industrial workers' real incomes provided additional support for the ancient class structures of the private plots. State merchants and even industrial enterprises also purchased food from ancients in the uncontrolled markets, but to a far lesser extent than industrial workers did. In such cases, the unequal exchanges benefiting the ancient private plots meant corresponding losses for state merchants and state industrial capitalists. State merchants were able to pass on their losses to industrial workers by charging much higher retail prices for such food, when industrial workers could not purchase them directly from farmers. State industrial capitalist enterprises often purchased food from ancients to serve free communal meals at the factories. The enterprises were sometimes able to recoup such outlays insofar as their workers accepted lower wages when such meals were provided. Finally, state merchants, industrial enterprises, and even industrial workers purchased relatively small quantities of food in uncontrolled markets from collective farms with produce for sale after fulfilling the state's quotas. Unequal exchanges there yielded the collective farms some extra non-class revenues from state merchants and industrial workers, and subsumed class revenues from state industrial enterprises. Once again, the state merchants passed on higher free market prices by charging industrial workers even higher retail prices. To the degree enterprises provided free meals to workers, they too tried to pass on such costs to workers by reducing money wages paid. Nonetheless, in these limited ways, the communist class structures on many collective farms received some support at the expense of industrial workers and the capitalist class structure of state enterprises. We deduce from the available evidence that state capitalist industrial enterprises sold their manufactured goods to state merchants either at or near their intrinsic values. This practice seemed to experience a decline, particularly after 1932, and especially from 1932 to 1935. Subsequently, these state merchants would then resell these goods to both urban and rural individual consumers, who used them as wage goods, as well as to enterprises such as collective farms, where they served as means of production. Until 1935, official prices for consumer goods were scarcely available in the state's retail stores. The evidence surrounding the pricing in these state stores appears rather opaque, suggesting a complex set of conditions. It appears that there were two types of state stores, one of which was sometimes referred to as commercial. The commercial stores could sell the same consumer goods as the other, more official state stores, but at considerably higher commercial prices. Moreover, the evidence also suggests that the official stores, at times, sold some consumer goods at the same commercial prices, although the rules governing such instances were unclear and appeared to vary by time and location. In addition to official and commercial prices, the state also set special prices for specific goods. Regardless of the murkiness surrounding the conditions of retail sales, the consistently high prices, well above the actual values, costs, of manufactured consumer goods, resulted in substantial net revenues for the state, effectively funneling a significant portion of merchants' profits into its coffers. Even after the abolition of rationing, the supply of manufactured consumer goods remained far below the demand. In essence, had the retail prices of these goods been set equal to their values, or costs, as Soviet calculations employing Marxian value concepts effectively equated these two terms, there would have been an overwhelming excess demand for these manufactured products. To address this, the state introduced turnover taxes on top of the costs of manufactured goods. The combination of these costs and the turnover tax resulted in prices that restricted the quantity demanded, what retail buyers could afford, to match the quantity that state industry could supply. When supply limitations led to long queues of customers, the state often responded by raising turnover taxes to mitigate the lines. Through this approach, the state garnered substantial revenues through the unequal exchanges imposed on the final purchasers of manufactured consumer goods. The state's management of trade and manufactured consumer goods, similar to its management of grain trade, emerged as a crucial source of state revenue. A parallel flow of resources into the state's coffers arose from the sale of manufactured capital goods to collective farms and individual farmers working within the traditional class structures on their private plots. State merchants purchased these capital goods at their intrinsic values from state capitalist industrial enterprises and subsequently sold them at higher retail prices to collective farms and individual farmers for use on their private plots. This transaction effectively depleted the surpluses of the communist and traditional class structures on the farms, as they had to cover the excessive price over the value of the manufactured capital goods they acquired as inputs for their production. Throughout the 1930s, despite some instances of unequal exchanges favoring collective farms, the state set prices for grain, raw materials, and manufactured consumer and capital goods handled by state merchants resulted in a significant shift of value. The collective farms suffered losses that corresponded to the gains realized by the state and state capitalist industry. These losses eroded the economic strength and sustainability of the communist class structures on the farms. In contrast, the ratio of retail to wholesale prices of most consumer goods led to unequal exchanges for industrial workers. Conversely, the traditional class structures on private plots fared considerably better. From our analysis, it appears that the free market prices they received for food products from their private plots exceeded their intrinsic values by an amount greater than the difference between the values and prices of the manufactured goods they purchased. Consequently, the price system yielded a net influx of value for them, in addition to the traditional surplus each of them generated and appropriated from their private plots. Importantly, this influx did not come at the expense of the state, and thus did not hinder its promotion of industrial growth. Instead, the traditional farmers' gains from these unequal exchanges stemmed from the high prices industrial workers paid for private plot produce, prices made possible by the scarcity of basic food products in state stores. When we weigh the various market losses and gains over the course of the 1930s, it becomes evident that Stalin's policies placed the ultimate economic burden of rapid industrialization squarely on the shoulders of workers in state capitalist industry and private communist agriculture. What they lost, the state and the traditional agricultural producers gained. The communist class structures on collective farms increasingly relied on their members' work within the traditional class structure of their private plots. However, this support for communism's survival simultaneously shifted the energy and commitment of collective farmers toward the traditional class structure. This shift essentially marked a transition from out of communism, although, of course, the inability to theorize agriculture's class structures as we have done here officially obscured this transformation. The industrial workers. The industrial workers of the Soviet Union in the 1930s, despite the increased productivity of Soviet industrial workers during the 1930s, their real wages declined. Chapman, 1963, page .166. We believe this reduction in the value of their labor power was further exacerbated by the decreased cost of producing wage goods due to productivity gains, alongside a reduction in real wages, which resulted from a decrease in commodities consumption. Consequently, Soviet workers experienced an increased rate of exploitation in the precise Marxian sense. They were producing more surplus value for the state's appropriation relative to the value created for themselves. Therefore, industrial workers became significant financiers of the Soviet industrialization efforts in the 1930s. A key factor in the rise of industrial workers' productivity was the state's successful efforts to intensify factory labor. This pressure began escalating in the late 1920s with the introduction of shock brigades and increased competition among workers. Officially, these brigades were considered instrumental in improving and accelerating industrial processes, reducing costs and intensifying labor. Koromia, 1990, page .120. Post-1935, the state further amplified pressure through the Stakhanovite movement and the widespread implementation of piece rate wages for workers. Mandel, 1968, page .594, Nove, 1989, page .222, Lewin, 1984, page .62. However, the piece rates seldom matched the increased value of commodities produced by the workers' intensified labor, leading to a rise in labor productivity. Additionally, the 5-year plan's continuous increase in capital-labor ratios in industry also contributed to higher productivity. The combination of falling real wages and rising labor productivity resulted in the generation of greater surplus values in Soviet state capitalist enterprises. This wage and productivity transformation occurred in the context of the state's efforts to cultivate a disciplined industrial labor force. Transitioning from ancient and communist class structures in agriculture to capitalist structures in industry presented numerous challenges. Workers and managers needed time to adapt to the new discipline and culture of state capitalist factories. Unlike private capitalist countries, where similar adjustments took decades, the Soviet experience compressed this process into just 10 years. This rapid transition led to high worker turnover, poor job discipline, and frequent conflicts between workers and managers. The blend of new workers from peasant backgrounds with a more established industrial labor force, coupled with inadequate housing and falling real wages, further complicated this transition. Nevertheless, the quick establishment of a disciplined, skilled, and loyal industrial workforce was a testament to the success of the USSR's drive to construct state industrial capitalism. The new industrial labor force largely supported Stalin and his policies, despite the increasing rate of exploitation. Thurston, 1996 ch. 5. This support was particularly strong among newer industrial workers, who largely endorsed the shock brigades, intensified competition, the Stakhanovite movement, and piece wages. They accepted the increased intensity of their labor and the reduction in the value of their labor power, partly due to the state's and the party's redefinition of their roles. They were treated as cultural heroes, provided with job security, and granted unprecedented recognition and dignity. Additionally, the state and party offered significant advancement opportunities, including mass education for their children. Recognized as the forerunners of the emerging communist civilization, industrial workers were willing to make present sacrifices for the anticipated future prosperity. The role of women in the workforce exemplified the era's contradictions. As millions of women began to sell their labor power to factories and offices, their lives changed dramatically. Female participation in the state capitalist economy rose from 28.6% in 1928 to 40% by 1940. Barber and Davies, 1994, page .88. They were acknowledged as equal contributors in building the new communist civilization, marking a significant change in their social identity. This increase in female labor force participation, combined with a general decrease in unemployment, meant that the fall in real consumption per capita for Soviet urban households during the 1930s was less severe than the decline in workers' real wages. Chapman, 1963, page .166 to 167. However, women, like their male counterparts, were subject to increasing rates of exploitation in state capitalist industries. They also faced the full brunt of unequal exchanges in retail markets, such as the stresses of shopping and price disparities. Outside the workplace, the situation for women remained challenging. Working outside the household did not free them from the long-established feudalism that persisted within it. Women continued to perform traditional household tasks for long hours, with only a portion of the fruits of their labor benefiting themselves. Their husbands often appropriated the rest, leading to a dual exploitation for women, once in state capitalist factories and again in their feudal households. This situation further strained Soviet families and had far-reaching negative social consequences. The assessment of the conditions of Soviet industrial workers in the 1930s is further complicated by the increased availability of free or very low-cost public services. The decline in wages for both sexes was partly offset by state-subsidized collective consumption, also known as the socialist wage. The state provided significant quantities of food at factory canteens, nurseries and childcare, medical care, and education. Aggregate real household consumption per capita showed an increase of about 10% between 1928 and 1937, a stark contrast to the decline in real consumption per capita excluding state-provided public services. Bergson, 1961, page .255. These public services helped alleviate some of the burdens of falling real wages, particularly for women, due to the availability of nurseries and childcare. The Soviet state could only maintain the increased exploitation of industrial workers and impose unequal exchanges on them as long as they accepted these conditions. The provision of public services, reinforcement of household feudalism, and the offering of nurseries were part of securing their acceptance. Additionally, the state fostered optimism about the future by highlighting the successes of Soviet industrialization. Workers' empowerment at their jobs, stemming from the high demand for their labor power and official ideology, also nurtured this optimism. Thurston, 1996, ch. 5 and especially pp. 169 to 172, illustrates how workers in factory meetings were involved in the Stakhanovite movement, gained and exercised rights to participate in setting work norms, including the pace of their labor. They openly criticized managers' control over their labor and voiced their concerns about the shortage of consumer goods. Despite the challenges of exploitation, shortages, and high prices, and the resulting tensions, many industrial workers remained strong supporters of Stalin and his vision of socialism. They focused not on the production, appropriation, and distribution of industrial surpluses, but rather on the new reality where factory and office managers appeared responsive to their complaints and criticisms. The Soviet Communist Party and media, to some extent, addressed workers' immediate concerns, reinforcing the absence of class consciousness in surplus labor terms among themselves and the broader population. Soviet state capitalism in the 1930s, building on the achievements of the NEP, successfully managed internal and external risks for over 50 years. However, it could not indefinitely sustain itself on revenue generated from exploitation, unequal exchanges, and other measures. The potential dangers that lurked throughout the 1930s eventually manifested as actual crises, particularly in the global context post-1975. The ensuing political and cultural changes led to complex class transitions, primarily a shift from state to private capitalism in industry. The decline in workers' real wages was mirrored by the state's continual expansion of means of production at a much faster rate than consumer goods production. Household consumption as a percentage of net national product fell from 82% in 1928 to just 55% in 1937, while net investment rose from 10% to 23% over the same period. Davies, Harrison, and Wheatcroft, 1994, page .272. The persistent excess demand for consumer goods led to daily tensions, particularly in state stores where frustrated shoppers faced poor retail service that deteriorated further during the 1930s. The indifference of retail staff, unable to satisfy shoppers' needs, exacerbated frustrations, creating a vicious cycle of resentment. Rising market prices in uncontrolled markets further angered consumers already frustrated by their experiences in state stores. Paradoxically, this consumer malaise helped sustain state capitalism while simultaneously undermining it. The state effectively shifted many of the strains and frustrations produced by the lowering of real wages and increased worker productivity onto the retail distribution system and households. Although this deflected workers' attention from their exploitation at their job sites, it turned consumption into a flashpoint for growing alienation from the Soviet system. The potential for this alienation to fatally erode support for the system was heightened by the risk of Soviet citizens becoming aware of and envious of the higher standards of individual consumption abroad. Efforts by Soviet leaders to address the problems of unsatisfied consumers often compounded these issues or were overshadowed by other priorities. For instance, raising money wages merely exacerbated the excess demand problem. Chapman, 1963, page .115. The second five-year plan attempted to balance the focus on industrial expansion of the first plan by emphasizing increased consumer goods production. However, fears of war in Europe redirected focus back to expanding means of production rather than consumption. Dobb, 1966, pp. .269 to 280. Similarly, rising labor productivity across all industries could have led to increased supplies of consumer goods. However, the state manipulated the price ratios between production means and consumption means, preventing this. Despite the falling unit costs, i.e., value in Marxian terms, of both types of goods, the state did not proportionately lower the prices of production means. Consequently, consumer goods enterprises faced prices increasingly higher than the costs values of the production means they bought. In simpler terms, consumer goods enterprises endured unequal exchanges with producer goods enterprises, squeezing their resources and hampering their potential growth rate in output. The looming threat of war in the late 1930s further exacerbated the discrimination against consumer goods production. This was rooted in policies stemming from the prevailing Soviet theory of socialist construction. This theory posited that following Lenin's initial socialization of industrial production and Stalin's expansion to agriculture, collectivization, the next step was to unfetter the industrial forces of production. This was interpreted as a surge in heavy industry growth, particularly in production means capacity. The hope was that after 1 or 2 five-year plans, the groundwork would be laid for a boom in consumer goods production and output, with goods eventually distributed based on need rather than work performed. The powerful Soviet state necessary to achieve this milestone would then begin to diminish. To transition from socialism to communism, several more years of worker sacrifices, coupled with massive industrial construction, were deemed necessary. International tensions further intensified these sacrifices, and the focus on non-consumer goods production. The ongoing bias against consumer goods production significantly impacted Soviet state capitalism. This included not just the tensions and conflicts in retail trade and among households, but also the limitation of investment in consumer goods production. Such limitations hindered the development of new technologies and productivity advancements in this sector. They also obstructed the creation of new consumer goods, like cars, household appliances, and consumer electronics, and improvements in the quality of existing goods. In summary, the triumphs of Soviet heavy industrialization were closely linked, both theoretically and practically, to the relative underdevelopment of consumer goods production and consumption. This underdevelopment later became a critical weakness of Soviet state capitalism, especially when compared to consumer goods development in the private capitalist economies of the West and Japan. Stalinism and class. The extensive impact and evolution of Stalinism, with its foundational commitment to building industrial state capitalism, fundamentally transformed agricultural class structures, introducing new class contradictions. Managing these contradictions necessitated a significant expansion of the state bureaucracy, influencing every facet of Soviet life, from cultural norms to political structures. Cultural and political dynamics under Stalinism endeavored to cultivate a culture that rationalized the numerous sacrifices of the era, aiming to integrate various social groups into the new industrial and agricultural systems. This cultural initiative often necessitated repressive measures when its goals were not met. Moreover, Stalinist policies faced internal contradictions, spurring intense debates within the state apparatus, reflecting deep ideological rifts. Economic dimensions of Stalinism. Economically, Stalinism was marked by ambitious efforts to enhance industrial productivity and discipline. It involved intricate management of relationships between industrial and agricultural sectors, focusing on maximizing outputs and maintaining strict workforce discipline. This chapter primarily examines the class processes of the USSR in the 1930s, exploring how surpluses were produced, appropriated, and distributed, and the impact of these class processes on Soviet development. In contrast, most analysts who studied the Soviet Union over the past 50 years have seldom considered these processes, much less examined them systematically. Instead, during the Cold War post-1945, the focus was obsessively on Stalinism. We conclude this chapter by exploring its relationship to class. Stalinism in the 1930s refers to the extreme or excessive nature of the main social transformations of that time. It signifies the dictatorial coordination of state and party apparatuses that enforce these transformations. Stalinism thus represents both the driving force and the resultant effects. It is more than just a variant of the broader concept of totalitarianism. Stalinism in the 1930s USSR, and later became the definitive example of this concept. For instance, Daub 1966 describes Soviet industrial growth in the 1930s as very similar to military strategy. Single-minded concentration on strategic timing and crucial line of thrust. Page 244. Cohen, 1977, criticized Stalinism as being more than just a totalitarian state, labeling it an excess, a wildly extravagant use of state power. Page 12. Fitzpatrick, 1984, portrayed Stalinism as a new culture established in the 1930s, terming it Cultural Revolution as Class War, pp. 7-40. Such descriptions across the political spectrum reflect a common understanding of the 1930s for Soviet society. The debate over Stalinism still influences studies of the USSR. Cohen, 1977. Many analysts view Stalinism as the phenomenal form of an underlying power drive that always governed the USSR. Emerging from the October Revolution and barely contained during the NEP, despotism was fully realized in Stalinism, embodied in Stalin and his centralized state bureaucracy. Others see Stalinism as a discontinuity in Soviet history, with some equating Stalinism with socialism or communism, while others highlight their incompatibility. Similar oppositions arise regarding the relationship of Stalinism to Russian history before 1917 and to global hostilities afterward. Our approach to Stalinism, considering it as the interplay of specific class and non-class processes, leads to different conclusions. The distinct class components of Stalinism included capitalist exploitation in state-owned industries, a mix of communist, ancient, and capitalist class structures in collective and state farms, and feudal and ancient class structures within households. The non-class components encompassed rapid economic growth, consumption suppression, political terror, and a mix of resigned pessimism and utopian hope in the cultural sphere. Our research found no evidence that Stalinism's specific class and non-class processes and contradictions were inevitable or intrinsic to Bolshevism, Marxism, Leninism, the Russian or Slavic soul, economic underdevelopment, backward agriculture, state industrial capitalism, foreign enmity, or Soviet geography. Stalinism emerged from the unique interplay of cultural, political, and economic circumstances, both foreign and domestic, specific to the 1930s. As these circumstances changed, so did Stalinism, shaped by them. Stalin's foundational commitment to build an industrial state capitalism with a focus on heavy industry led to the replacement of certain agricultural class structures with others. New class contradictions emerged alongside the gains from these changes, posing different dangers to the USSR, akin to those leading to collectivization. Stalin's efforts to manage these contradictions significantly shaped every aspect of Stalinism. The process of managing the contested class structures of the 1930s compelled Stalin's state apparatus to expand into a massive state bureaucracy. A significant portion of state revenues was allocated to recruit, train, pay, and equip a large bureaucratic force. Adapting this bureaucracy to rapidly changing circumstances was as challenging and urgent as its establishment. Beyond its economic roles, the bureaucracy also aimed to create a culture that accepted or at least tolerated massive bureaucratic intervention in all life aspects. Stalinism included the high financial costs of sustaining the massive bureaucracy and the immense social and psychological impacts of its activities. Soviet farmers and industrial workers experienced increasing surveillance and control over their political, cultural, and economic activities. Intellectuals and cultural producers either aligned with the bureaucracy's mission or faced demonization. The Stalinist policies and bureaucracy encountered their own contradictions, leading to controversies within the state. Debates from the 1920s continued, with some groups opposing rapid socialist industrialization due to its severe constraints on the USSR's non-socialist agriculture. Even those agreeing with Stalin's theory of socialist construction differed on the methods and pace of Stalinism. Thus, Stalinism represented precisely the outcomes these officials had warned against: chaos, stagnation, a disillusioned working class, a repressive bureaucracy, and a resentful population. Among Stalinism's early critics were many old Bolsheviks who challenged not only specific policies, but also the entirety of Stalinism. Their social influence presented a major challenge to Stalin and the emerging Stalinism, sparking a struggle over which ideas, politics, and economic plans would prevail. This was more than a power struggle. It was a contest over which class processes would be promoted or extinguished, defining the experiences of Soviet citizens in exploitative or non-exploitative class positions and the roles of state and party power. Stalinism, in part, emerged as a response to this opposition. Stalin's group suppressed critics within the state and party, silencing their arguments and alternative strategies. During the purges of 1933 and 1937-38, many officials, particularly older Bolsheviks, experienced in NEP economic policy debates, were removed. They were replaced by younger cadres loyal to Stalin and Stalinism, who worked to spread this allegiance across Soviet society. Throughout the 1930s, Stalin's loyal officials carried out bureaucratic processes that expanded industrial state capitalism, extracted surpluses from communist and ancient class structures in agriculture, and reinforced feudal and ancient class structures in households. For example, they raised the state to a position of utmost importance for achieving communism, a role never before assigned by any Marxist movement. Stalinism declared classes abolished, with state-owned factories and collectivized agriculture, now free from class conflicts, poised to realize their productive potential under state management. Stalinist culture and politics often veered into repression, yet they also empowered workers in certain ways. Workers' meetings in factories and collective farms, limited freedoms for managers to navigate official plans, and women's participation in the workforce allowed for some expression of concerns. Stalinist society thus displayed a curious blend of partial freedoms amidst growing repression, a balance maintained by Stalinism's role in upholding the specific Soviet social formation of the 1930s. Stalinist officials directly planned and managed industrial enterprises and through the MTS collective farms. A distinctively Stalinist economy emerged, characterized by intense campaigns to improve labor productivity in industry and increase food and raw material provision in agriculture. The cumulative effects of Stalinism's cultural, political, and economic processes enabled the class structures in Soviet industry and agriculture to support industrial growth. The Stalinist period of the USSR represents neither a counter-revolution to socialism nor a continuation of it. Instead, it signifies a specific phase in the development of the USSR's mix of class and non-class processes. Stalinism encompassed the non-class processes deemed necessary by Stalin's group to secure this mix, which they defined as socialism. Its primary connection to communism was its collectivization of agriculture, although it also undermined communist class structures on collective farms after establishing them. In summary, Stalinism's main outcome and purpose was to solidify the predominance of an expanding industrial state capitalism in the USSR. This foundation enabled Stalinism to modernize industry, organize a massive state and party bureaucracy, build a powerful army, initiate an ambitious social welfare program, and impose a rigid political and cultural statism. However, sustaining industrial growth and securing the processes comprising Stalinism required expanding surpluses from state capitalist workers and collective agriculture. The final chapter will continue exploring these dynamics, focusing on the post-war Stalinist period and the eventual fading of Stalinism in subsequent reforms. It will examine how, when, and why the Soviet state ultimately could not generate sufficient surplus to sustain the state capitalism it termed socialism, or even maintain the USSR as a nation. Class structures after World War II. The USSR endured profound destruction and trauma during World War II, arguably the worst suffered by any combatant nation. Keep 1995, Dunham 1976, 214 ff. However, this did not significantly alter the pre-war class structures. Industry remained under state capitalism. Despite various reforms and liberalizations following Stalin's death, successive regimes did not fundamentally challenge or question the role of state capitalist industry in what they termed Soviet socialism. It was only under Gorbachev and Yeltsin that a significant shift from state to private capitalist industrial enterprises occurred. Brightory and Stewart 1998, 301 to 304. In agriculture, the primary change was the distribution of farms among different types of coexisting class structures of production. The importance of state capitalist farms increased in relation to both collective farms and the ancient class structures of individual private plots. Some collective farms maintained their communist class structures, while others transitioned, contributing to the rise in collective farms with capitalist class structures. Class Contradictions and the Collapse 283. This necessitates referring to communist and/or capitalist collective farms, as the term collective farms omits their diverse and shifting class structures. Households continued to exhibit a mix of feudal and ancient class structures. Alongside these entities, a second economy existed throughout Soviet history, comprising unofficial, often unacknowledged, and sometimes illegal enterprises. Grossman, 1977-1989. This sector, mainly organized around ancient class structures, expanded rapidly post-mid-1970s, altering the balance among the USSR's class structures. The state continued to derive revenue from industrial state capitalist enterprises, private communist collective farms, and private capitalist collective farms. This was achieved through state-set prices favoring industrial products and taxes on farm enterprises. Additionally, the state increasingly appropriated surpluses directly from state capitalist farms, reallocating resources within its various sectors. Class Theory and History 284. The state also relied on indirect taxes, such as turnover taxes on retail commodity prices, which became a significant source of revenue by the 1980s. While this increased state revenue, it reduced workers' real personal incomes and contributed to excess demand for consumer goods, partially offset by post-war increases in consumer goods production. The post-war Soviet economy was a complex interplay of various class structures, each providing and undermining the conditions for the other's existence. State capitalist industrial enterprises, for instance, interacted with state capitalist farms and private collective farms, both supporting and exploiting them. This dynamic affected the viability of farms and the broader economy. Households, particularly those with women performing surplus labor, both supported and strained the larger economic structure. Women's dual role as surplus producers inside and outside households led to exhaustion, limited incomes, and strained household relationships, impacting worker discipline and productivity in industrial and agricultural enterprises. Lapidus, 1978. Despite these challenges, the USSR maintained its complex class configurations for 5 decades, driven by various factors including socialist fervor and external threats. However, post-war changes, particularly in the 1970s and 1980s, destabilized the balance among Soviet class structures, leading to widespread dissatisfaction and setting the stage for the late 1980s collapse. Throughout this period, the lack of a sophisticated class analysis within the USSR, partly due to the official denial of complex class structures in a socialist society, hindered understanding and addressing the systemic issues. The absence of such analysis also limited external perspectives on the Soviet Union's challenges. In summary, 2 fundamental questions faced the post-war USSR. Could the state sustain its economic and political programs through the surpluses and revenues it generated? And could it manage the complex and fragile class structures to prevent societal collapse? The final sections of this chapter delve into the cultural, political, and economic shifts that ultimately led to the Soviet Union's crisis and dissolution.
Boom! Until our narratives intertwine once more, I remain Tim. Wishing you insightful journeys. Brace for tomorrow, for with it comes another chapter in the annals of Treaslav peace and the reactionaries. Farewell until we reconvene.